Hello everyone. I am your storyteller, here to guide you through a tale that will creep beneath your skin and linger long after the screen fades to black. If you're here to find peace and drift into sleep, stay close, but beware, for what you're about to hear may awaken shadows within your mind. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Now, settle in. Breathe deeply. Let the night enfold you as the story unfolds. The lighthouse had been watching me long before I ever saw it, a silent sentinel, looming over Raven Point like a forgotten guardian of secrets too dark for daylight. The first time I felt its presence was the moment I crested the hill overlooking the jagged coastline, my camera bag heavy, the Atlantic wind slicing through my jacket like a cold blade. Below me, on twisted, jagged rocks that seemed to claw at the sky, stood Blackwater Light, 40 feet of weathered stone and rust-streaked metal. Its lamp room had been dark for nearly 30 years, abandoned, or so the records said. The assignment was pitched simply, an overnight shoot for Coastal Horizon's Halloween issue. Marcus Chen, the editor, had promised me the keeper's quarters still had electricity and that the local historical society would grant access. Perfect for atmospheric shots, he'd said, gothic and isolated. But he hadn't mentioned the way the tower seemed to recoil from the sea, as if it knew something foul lay beneath the waves it once ruled. As I fumbled with the ancient lock on the door, my hands trembled, not from the biting October cold but from a creeping dread I couldn't shake. Since parking the rental beside the narrow dirt road, a sensation had clawed at my nerves, the feeling of being watched, judged by eyes that didn't belong to any living soul. Inside, the air was thick with salt and decades of silence. Dust motes floated in the dying light, drifting like ghosts through salt-stained windows. The furniture sat frozen in time, a wooden table scarred by years of coffee mugs and forgotten maps, two chairs facing each other like old conspirators, and a stone fireplace blackened by long-forgotten fires. The weight of abandonment pressed on me, raising goosebumps along my arms. I'd researched Blackwater's history on the drive from Boston. The lighthouse had been active since 1847, guiding ships safely until it was decommissioned in 1994 when the Coast Guard replaced it with an automated beacon. Theodore Voss, the last keeper, had tended the light for 37 years before retiring to Florida. But something didn't add up. Local logs indicated the light had stopped months before the official decommissioning, yet several ships reported glimpsing its beam in the dark period. Coast Guard records showed no activity. Whispers among fishermen hinted at strange lights and eerie sounds. An invisible history lurking beneath the official story. As the sun sank, I set up my cannon, focusing on capturing the lighthouse bathed in the golden hour's fading glow, weathered stone stark against an ominous sky, jagged rocks framing the scene like watchful sentinels. But then my eyes were drawn upward. The Fresnel lens, dormant for decades, seemed alive. It pulsed faintly with a spectral glow, like embers that refused to die. A cold shiver slithered down my spine. The waves below, once rhythmic and soothing, now seemed to echo a sinister rhythm, an unspoken warning. My hands shook, the viewfinder blurred, and a whisper of wrongness threaded through the wind, threading cold into my bones. I caught my breath. Something waited in the darkness above, in the very heart of the lighthouse. Of course. Let me continue the story, deepening the mystery and weaving in more eerie, suspenseful elements to draw the listener further into the chilling atmosphere. The tone remained slow, deliberate, and immersive, each sentence crafted to stir unease and curiosity. The first night wrapped the coast in a thick, suffocating darkness. The winds moaned through cracked windows sounded like distant cries, half forgotten, half imagined. I lit a lantern inside the keeper's quarters, its flickering flame casting long shadows that danced and twisted along peeling wallpaper and aged wood. I set up my tripod near the window, aiming to capture the lighthouse's silhouette against the night sky studded with indifferent stars. But no camera could truly capture what pressed against the edges of my vision, the unnatural stillness in the air, the way the darkness seemed to thicken, as if the night itself conspired to swallow the light whole. Hours passed. The beam of the automated beacon from the nearby tower swept mechanically across the harbor, cold and sterile. But then, from the top of Blackwater Light, something else stirred. A faint glow began to pulse, soft, irregular, like the beat of a wounded heart. It was no ordinary light. The Fresnel lens flickered in a rhythm that defied logic, casting eerie patterns onto the rocky shore below. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting into shapes that resembled hands, faces, things half seen in a nightmare. My breath caught when I heard it, a low, guttural hum vibrating through the stone floor beneath me. Not mechanical, not natural. It was a sound that seemed to seep from the very walls, echoing an ancient sorrow and rage. My skin prickled, every instinct screamed to flee. But curiosity held me fast. I climbed the narrow, spiraling staircase inside the tower, each step creaking beneath my weight. The darkness inside was thick and suffocating, the beam from my flashlight barely pierced the void. At times, I felt the temperature drop sharply, as if invisible fingers brushed my neck and chilled my soul. At the summit, the lamp room lay in ruins, glass shattered, rust crawling over cold metal. Yet the Fresnel lens hung intact, suspended like a ghostly eye. The pulsing light continued, a spectral heartbeat against the void. Suddenly, a cold wind whipped through the broken windows, extinguishing my flashlight. I stood alone, engulfed in darkness so complete it pressed against my eyelids. And then came the whisper. A voice, barely audible, threading through the shadows. "Why have you come?" I froze. The sound was not carried on the wind, it echoed inside my mind, a voice older than time, hollow and accusing. No human presence, yet unmistakably alive. I reached out, my hand trembling, to touch the lens. The cold was unbearable, like ice water rushing through my veins. A sudden vision flashed behind my closed eyelids, a shipwreck in raging seas, screaming faces swallowed by darkness, a keeper's desperate vigil, and something lurking beneath the waves, watching, waiting. When I opened my eyes, the lamp room was silent. The pulsing light faded to black. I stumbled back down the stairs, heart hammering, every shadow now alive with unseen eyes. The walls seemed to close in, whispering secrets too terrible to speak. Back in the keeper's quarters, I locked the door behind me, but the feeling of being watched did not relent. As I packed my equipment, the lantern flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that morphed into figures, silent, watching, waiting. Outside, the sea crashed with a fury I had not heard before. It was as if Blackwater was alive, angry that its secrets had been disturbed. I don't know how long I sat in that cold room, wrapped in silence, waiting for dawn. But when morning finally broke, pale and uncertain, I knew one thing with chilling clarity. Some lights are not meant to be rekindled. Some places guard their darkness jealously. And Blackwater Light still watches. Always. The following days blurred into a strange limbo. The locals spoke little of Blackwater Light, and when they did, their eyes darkened with unease. The Historical Society's cheerful assurances gave way to nervous glances and hastily changed subjects. It was as if the lighthouse was a wound they all dared not touch. Determined to uncover the truth, I sifted through dusty archives in the town's tiny library. Among brittle newspapers and yellowed logs, I found a collection of old journals, handwritten by Theodore Voss himself. His entries started as meticulous records of daily maintenance, weather conditions, and ship sightings. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The last entries were frantic, filled with cryptic warnings. The light falters but something moves beneath the waves. Shadows no ship should know. The beam must stay alive, no matter the cost. Voices in the fog call my name. They promise salvation or doom. I fear the sea no longer protects us, but hides something worse. I cannot leave. I am bound to this place, to the light, to the darkness it keeps at bay. Pray someone listens. A chill settled over me as I read. The journals painted a picture of a man haunted, trapped between duty and terror. That night, I returned to the lighthouse. The air was thick with fog, tendrils curling like fingers across the rocky shore. The beam in the old lamp room remained dormant, yet a faint glow pulsed deep within the stones, a heartbeat beneath the surface. As I crossed the threshold, the floorboards groaned beneath my feet, echoing through the hollow spaces. The salty smell mixed with something foul, decay, or perhaps something more sinister. A sudden chill swept through the hall, and I heard it, the faintest scrape, like nails dragging slowly against wood. I spun around, flashlight piercing the gloom, but nothing was there. Then, a whisper carried on the wind, barely audible. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. The walls seemed to close in, the temperature dropping until my breath frosted in the air. From the darkness came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the spiral staircase above. I dared to climb. Each step creaked with agonizing slowness, and shadows clung to the walls like cobwebs. At the summit, the lamp room lay shrouded in darkness, the shattered glass casting fractured reflections of the faint moonlight. Then, out of the silence, a figure appeared, indistinct, almost translucent, a man in a weathered keeper's uniform, eyes hollow yet burning with an unspoken dread. He reached out, his voice a hoarse rasp. "The light, it must never die. For if it does, the sea will claim us all." Before I could respond, the apparition vanished like mist, leaving only the echo of his warning. Suddenly, the Fresnel lens sparked to life, casting a cold, unnatural glow that illuminated the storm clouds gathering overhead. The waves below roared with fury, and the lighthouse trembled as if alive. I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with a thunderous crash. Darkness enveloped me, and whispers filled the room, voices of lost sailors, mournful and accusing. Panic surged, but my hands found the lock. With a final, desperate twist, the door gave way. I tumbled into the night air, gasping for breath. Behind me, Blackwater light pulsed one last time before plunging into darkness once more. As I fled down the rocky path, I understood the terrible truth. Blackwater was no mere lighthouse. It was a beacon for something ancient and hungry. And it was waiting. Days bled into restless nights as Blackwater's grip tightened around my thoughts. Sleep became a fragile dream, fractured by whispers carried on the salt wind and shadows that clung long after dawn. The locals' silence had transformed into uneasy glances whenever I mentioned the lighthouse, their eyes hinting at secrets buried deep beneath the rocks and waves. One evening, at the dimly lit tavern where fishermen gathered, I finally coaxed a story from old Captain Mallory, a man whose weathered face was etched with salt and sorrow. "They say Blackwater don't just guide ships," he muttered, voice low as the crashing surf outside. "It's a gateway, a thin veil between here and the deep dark. They call it, the Watcher's Light." He paused, wiping a trembling hand across his beard. Back in the old days, keepers vanished without a trace, just disappeared into the fog, swallowed whole. Some say the sea claimed them. Others say they were taken by the things lurking beneath. Creatures old as the earth, bound to the light's flame. His eyes burned with a haunted knowledge. The last keeper, boss, he kept the light burning, no matter the cost. Kept the darkness at bay. But the light faltered, and the watcher stirred. I felt the weight of his words like a stone sinking deep inside me. That night, I returned to Blackwater Light, compelled by a need I no longer understood. The path was slick with sea spray and tangled with thorny bushes, each step echoing a heartbeat faster than my own. As I reached the keeper's quarters, the air thickened, heavy with brine and something metallic, like blood beneath the salt. Inside, the journals lay open, as if waiting for me. I traced Boss's final entry with trembling fingers. The light dims. The sea whispers hunger. I feel the watcher's gaze. It waits beneath the waves, hungry for the flame. If I fail, all will be lost. A sudden chill swept through the room. Then, from the darkness, the flicker of a candle appeared, soft, unnatural. Shadows warped and writhed on the walls, forming shapes that defied reason, twisted faces, clawed hands reaching, mouths agape in silent screams. I heard a voice, low and coaxing. "Stay, keep the light." My vision blurred as cold tendrils wrapped around my mind, pulling me toward the lamp room. Up the spiraling stairs I climbed again, each step a descent into madness. At the summit, the Fresnel lens pulsed like a living heart, veins of ghostly light coursing through its glass. Suddenly, the spectral figure of Theodore Voss appeared once more, his eyes pleading. "Light the flame, or the watcher will rise." Behind him, the fog twisted and churned into monstrous shapes, hulking forms with glowing eyes beneath the waves. A terrible understanding seized me. The lighthouse was not a beacon for sailors. It was a prison. A fragile barrier between the world of the living and a hunger from the abyss. I fumbled with the ancient lantern, its wick dry and brittle. With shaking hands, I struck a match. Flame flickered, then roared to life, casting a golden glow that pushed back the encroaching shadows. The watcher howled from the depths, a sound that tore at the soul. But the light held. For now. I collapsed, breath ragged, heart pounding a warning. Blackwater light was a curse wrapped in stone and steel. And the hunger beneath was eternal. By 10 p.m., I had retreated to the keeper's quarters, the ancient building creaking around me like a living creature. October's chill had turned bitter, and the only heat came from a temperamental radiator that clanked and groaned as if chained to some unseen torment. I spread my sleeping bag on the narrow cot in the old keeper's bedroom, trying to convince myself that the dawn's light would repay the night's discomfort. But sleep was a stranger. The lighthouse sighed and shifted, timber joints contracting and expanding with the cold. Beneath these familiar sounds, something else lurked, a grinding, deep and rhythmic, like monstrous gears grinding in the darkness above, somewhere near the lamp room crowning the tower. The clock on my phone glowed 11:47 p.m. I'd been lying awake for over an hour, the grinding growing louder, more insistent. Along with it came voices, carried faintly on the salt wind, a murmur of words just beyond reach, like a language I once knew but had forgotten. They twisted and turned through the air, patterns forming and dissolving in a maddening dance. Then, at midnight sharp, the Fresnel lens began to turn. I scrambled to the window, heart hammering so violently I could feel it pounding in my temples. Above me, the massive lens rotated smoothly, but wrong. It moved counterclockwise, reversing every instinct I had about lighthouses. Each lighthouse beacon I'd ever known swept faithfully clockwise across the dark ocean. This was deliberate defiance. The grinding surged in tandem, metal against metal, as the beam did not reach out toward the waters. Instead, it projected images into the very darkness, three-dimensional phantoms hanging in the night air like spectral photographs. What I saw twisted my mind. There I was, aged 15, standing on a stage accepting a photography award I'd never won. The auditorium was filled with faces I didn't recognize, classmates that seemed both familiar and strange. My parents applauded, younger than memory allowed, my mother wearing a dress she never owned. The lens continued its reverse sweep, and the scene shifted. Now I was in a college darkroom I'd never entered. I handled prints with deft expertise I lacked, guiding them through chemical baths, producing images that had never existed. Beside me stood a woman, beautiful and serene, her dark eyes full of knowing and warmth. I had never met her, yet a deep ache in my chest told me I loved her. Her lips moved, but I could not hear her words. Her expression spoke of pride, affection, and a loss too profound to name. Rational thought began to unravel. These were not memories. They were impossible realities, roads never taken, dreams never dreamed, rendered with haunting clarity. The grinding in the lens now seemed to pierce my skull. My hearing vanished, the crashing waves below the cliffs fell silent. Panic rose as I pressed my hands to my ears, but sound was gone, replaced by a crushing silence that pressed into my mind. The vibrations of the tower underfoot were all that remained. The beam swept again, revealing yet another impossible tableau. I saw myself at a gallery opening, surrounded by admirers gazing at photographs I had never taken, images of impossible landscapes. Forests where trees grew downwards from the sky, roots like tangled webs of stars. Oceans flowing uphill against gravity's cruel decree. Mountains folding in on themselves like intricate origami, peaks curling into valleys in surreal harmony. Though impossible, these places felt more vivid, more real than any I'd ever known. And there I stood, confident, beside the same mysterious woman from the darkroom, her smile calm, almost knowing. But just as suddenly, the vision shattered. The lens ground to a halt. The unnatural light died. Darkness swallowed the lighthouse. And I was alone, heart hammering, trapped in a silence thicker than the fog outside. The same dark-haired woman from the darkroom vision stood beside me now, radiant and calm. Her engagement ring caught the gallery lights, scattering tiny rainbows that danced across her slender fingers, fragments of joy and promise I had never known in my waking life. We moved through the crowd with the easy intimacy of partners who had long shared their days and nights, the kind of connection I had never experienced in reality. Her eyes held a depth of love and understanding that pierced through the walls I'd built around myself for so long. The Fresnel lens ground on, relentless and hypnotic. And then, as abruptly as my hearing had vanished, my sense of smell disappeared too. The familiar salt tang of the sea, the musty scent of aging wood and brine, even the faint smell of my own skin, all evaporated into an empty void. I was stripped bare, existing only through my sight and the fragile, faltering testimony of what little remained. More impossible memories unfolded before me, glimpses of a life I had never lived. I saw myself teaching photography workshops in sun-drenched studios and wild landscapes I'd never visited, guiding eager students whose faces seemed heartbreakingly familiar despite my never having met them. I watched myself receive a Pulitzer Prize for a body of work documenting environmental destruction deep in the Amazon rainforest, though I'd never set foot in South America. And then, the wedding. The dark-haired woman stood beside me, radiant with a smile that could light the darkest room, as she spoke vows I could not hear in a ceremony I had never attended. The laughter, the tears, the quiet moments of shared joy, all impossible yet achingly vivid. With every slow rotation of the lens, pieces of my real self were stripped away. Not merely my senses, but something far more profound, the certainty of my own existence, the coherence of who I truly was. These impossible memories felt more authentic, more meaningful than the fractured life I'd actually lived. I found myself doubting which was real, the lonely photographer who'd driven up from Boston for a magazine assignment, or the successful artist who had found love, achievement, and belonging. The grinding beneath me intensified, vibrations humming through the stone foundation and coursing into my bones. I could feel the slow, relentless rotation of the lens in my very skeleton, as if I were becoming part of the mechanism itself, becoming an instrument of the lighthouse's strange will. Fear rippled through me, but alongside it, a strange comfort blossomed. If I could join the lens, become one with its light, perhaps I could live in those better memories, exist in the world where I had everything my waking life had denied me. Then the voices appeared. Not as sound, but as forms, shimmering shapes of light twisting and weaving within the beam, suggesting human figures without fully taking shape. They reached out with gestures that bypassed my missing hearing, speaking directly to my consciousness. Their message was simple and terrifyingly clear. Step into the light. Join the memories. Become who you were meant to be. My legs moved before I could stop them, carrying me toward the narrow door leading to the lighthouse's interior spiral staircase. Each step felt inevitable, predestined, as if I'd walked this path countless times in dreams or nightmares. The stone stairs spiraled upward into darkness. My vision, flickering and fragile, was barely enough to guide me through the narrow, claustrophobic passage. My hands found the cold walls, tracing grooves smoothed by decades of keepers who had climbed before me, each step echoing with silent history. And yet, as I ascended, fragments of my actual memories began to reassert themselves. The first camera my grandfather gave me for my 13th birthday, a battered Nikon that had opened a window to the world. The satisfaction of waiting hours in freezing mountain air, finally capturing the perfect sunrise. And Sarah, the girlfriend I had pushed away 2 years earlier, frightened of commitment, convinced I was unworthy of lasting love. These real memories felt thin and fragile against the impossible visions of the lens, but they were mine, flawed, imperfect, and deeply human. The man climbing these stairs was lonely, uncertain, but undeniably real. I stopped. The voices pressed closer, their silent urgency filling the confined space. They showed me more visions, myself as a father, patiently teaching a small boy to frame a shot. Growing old beside the dark-haired woman whose name I'd never learned, dying peacefully surrounded by a family I would never have. Beautiful impossibilities that filled my chest with longing. But I forced myself to remember why I had come. The narrow spiral staircase ended at a heavy, rusted door, the threshold between the world I knew and the one the lighthouse beckoned me to enter. My hand trembled as I reached for the cold iron handle, the voices swirling around me like a tide of silent whispers, urging, pleading, promising. Beyond this door lay the lamp room, the heart of the lighthouse, the place where the lens had called to me since the moment I set foot on Raven Point. I stood there, breath shallow, pulse drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The choices stretched before me like two paths shrouded in fog. One led to the glowing light, the impossible memories, the radiant woman, the life I had never lived but yearned for with aching desperation. A world where success and love were not distant dreams but tangible truths. The promise of becoming someone greater than I was, escaping loneliness and failure. The other path was darker, uncertain, imperfect, but real. The fractured life I'd lived, with all its pain and regret, mistakes and missed chances, but also moments of raw honesty and quiet beauty. I pressed my palm against the rusted door, feeling the weight of history and the faint vibration of the rotating lens beyond. The voices pressed closer, their silent song intoxicating, whispering of belonging, of becoming whole. And yet, deep within me, a fragile spark flickered, reminders of my true self. The memory of Sarah's smile, warm and bittersweet. The feel of my grandfather's Nikon in my hands. The ache of lonely nights spent chasing light through a lens, searching for meaning. I took a breath heavy with years of doubt and longing. Slowly, I pulled the door open. Inside, the lamp room was bathed in an otherworldly glow. The massive Fresnel lens pulsed, its ghostly light casting fractured rainbows onto the weathered walls. The dark-haired woman stood within the light's embrace, her eyes shining with endless love and sorrow. She reached out to me, her voice finally breaking the silence, not with words, but with a profound understanding that filled the space between us. I stepped forward, heart torn. Would I surrender to the radiant illusion, the perfect life promised by the light? Or would I turn away, embracing the messy, beautiful reality that was truly mine? A final grinding echoed through the tower, the mechanism slowing, poised between motion and stillness. And in that suspended moment, I closed my eyes and chose. I stood there, the weight of eternity pressing on my chest, the radiant light spilling over the worn stones like liquid dreams. Her eyes, those endless, knowing eyes, called to me with a promise of belonging, of fulfillment beyond all my longing. The voices whispered still, soft as a lover's caress, urging me to step fully into their world, to become the person I had always wished I could be. For a heartbeat, the allure was irresistible. To escape the fractured shadows of my real life, to dissolve into a perfect memory crafted by light and desire, how easy that choice seemed. But as the pulse of the Fresnel lens beat beneath my feet, a cold truth settled within me. Illusions shimmer and beckon, radiant and intoxicating, yet they are but shadows shaped by our yearning. Reality is messy, imperfect, sometimes unbearably painful, but it is ours, shaped by every flawed choice, every wound and every triumph. And so I hesitated. Between the blinding glow and the silent dark, I lingered, neither fully surrendering nor retreating. Perhaps I would follow the light, becoming part of the lighthouse's eternal story, a whispered memory within its ghostly beam. Or perhaps I would return down the winding stairs, carrying the weight of my imperfect, beautiful life into the coming dawn. The lens ground to a slow halt, the voices fading into the vast silence of the night. Outside, the ocean's roar resumed, indifferent and eternal. And in that suspended moment, I understood. Some lights are not meant to guide us home, but to show us the depths of our own longing. Some illusions are mirrors, reflecting what we desire most. And the truest journey lies in embracing the fragile, luminous reality we carry within ourselves. As we leave Blackwater Light behind, I invite you to pause and look inward. Each of us carries flickering lights, dreams, memories, and the shadows of what might have been. Sometimes, those lights illuminate paths of hope, other times, they cast illusions that tempt us to escape from our own truth. But within the quiet spaces between longing and reality, there lies a profound discovery, the courage to embrace who we are, imperfect and evolving. May you find the strength to walk your own winding staircase, to hold your stories, both light and shadow, with compassion. And in doing so, may you uncover the radiant truth that lives not in distant dreams, but in the fragile, beautiful reality of your own heart. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story touched something within you, please like, share, and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what lights guide your way through darkness. Until next time, may your path be illuminated with gentle clarity. It wasn't for the assignment that I'd come to understand the truth, but because something had been quietly pulling me back to this place. The lighthouse hadn't truly been abandoned. Instead, it had been collecting people like me, photographers, artists, dreamers who stumbled under its spell and chose the perfect illusion of impossible memories over the flawed messiness of real life. I needed to know when the light had truly gone dark, and who had been the last to make the choice before me. Fighting every instinct that urged me upward toward the lamp room, I turned and descended the spiral staircase. The voices in the light grew louder, more insistent, offering increasingly vivid glimpses of the life I might have had. But with each step downward, my resolve grew stronger. That successful photographer in those visions might have achieved everything I'd dreamed of, but he wasn't me. He was a fragile construction of light and longing, beautiful, yes, but hollow. Back in the keeper's quarters, I searched through the logbooks and records the historical society had left behind. My sense of touch, mercifully intact, allowed me to feel the rough texture of the pages and the indentation of ink on paper. Official records stated the light operated until September 1994, but margin notes in Theodore Voss's meticulous handwriting told a different story. His entries became erratic throughout 1993. He wrote of strange dreams, of the lens showing him visions of the life he might have lived if he'd never become a lighthouse keeper. He described losing his hearing during night watches, then his sense of smell, then taste. The final entry, dated March 15, 1994, was barely legible. The light wants me to join it. It has shown me 40 years of better choices. But I know what happens to keepers who climb those stairs at midnight. They become part of the beam, feeding it with their regrets and unfulfilled dreams. I won't go. I won't give it what it wants. The log ended there. But a yellowed newspaper clipping, folded and tucked between the pages, told the rest. Theodore Voss had been found 3 days later, alive but catatonic, his vacant eyes fixed on the lamp room above. He spent the remainder of his life in a care facility, never speaking again, but constantly moving his hands as if adjusting camera settings or polishing glass. Now I understood. The lighthouse didn't want to kill its visitors. It wanted to consume their potential, their dreams of better lives. It fed on the gap between reality and possibility, growing stronger with every soul who chose its perfect lies over imperfect truth. The grinding of the lens continued overhead, and I felt my sense of taste slipping away, leaving me nearer to that same void. Soon, I knew, my sense of touch would follow, and I'd be left with only sight to navigate the world. But I also knew something the lighthouse hadn't counted on. I could choose to live with my disappointments and failures rather than escape into beautiful impossibilities. As dawn approached, the grinding slowed. The visions in the beam grew faint, and my stolen senses began to return, touch first, then taste, then smell, and finally, the symphony of sound. The crash of waves against the rocks had never sounded more beautiful. The Fresnel lens settled into stillness as the first rays of sunlight kissed its weathered surface. In that growing light, I finally saw the apparatus clearly. Suspended within its glass were shapes that had once been human. Not physically trapped, but caught as patterns of light and memory. Dozens, maybe hundreds, held captive in the beautiful prison of lives they'd never lived. Among them was Theodore Voss. I realized he had resisted the call, but in gazing too long into the impossible, he lost himself anyway. His body survived, but his consciousness had joined the collection of dreams and regrets that fueled the lighthouse's eerie beacon. With trembling hands, I packed my equipment, careful not to look back toward the lamp room. The photographs I'd taken the evening before would have to suffice for the magazine. They showed only an abandoned lighthouse at sunset, ordinary, melancholic, but real in a way the visions could never be. As I drove away from Raven Point, I caught a fleeting glimpse of the lighthouse in my rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw the dark-haired woman from the vision standing beside it, waving goodbye with a smile full of infinite sadness. But when I looked again, she was gone, vanished like a fading photograph, and the lighthouse stood empty against the pale morning sky. I never published the story of what I'd experienced that night. Who would believe it? Instead, I locked that truth away like a secret negative, developing it only in the darkroom of my own memory. Yet, the experience changed me. At first, in small ways, simple acts of reconciliation. I called Sarah and apologized for the fears and doubts that had driven her away. Then I made larger changes. I began taking photographs not just for magazines or galleries, but for myself, capturing the imperfect, fragile beauty of the world as it truly was. Sometimes, in the deepest hours before dawn, I still hear it, the grinding of that massive Fresnel lens. Its call is hypnotic, whispering visions of the photographer I might have become, of the life I could have led. But now I recognize that sound for what it is, the hungry mechanism of a predator feeding on human potential. The lighthouse still stands at Raven Point, its lamp room dark and its Fresnel lens officially silent. But I know better. Somewhere in a coastal New England town, another photographer will hear about an abandoned lighthouse offering perfect shots for a Halloween assignment. They'll drive up with their cameras and dreams of better lives. And at midnight, the lens will begin to turn. I can only hope they'll be strong enough to walk away from the beautiful impossibilities it offers. To choose their imperfect reality over its perfect lies. Because the most terrifying thing isn't being trapped by our failures. It's losing ourselves in the endless hunger for something better, something we were never meant to have. The lens remembers everything we wish to forget about ourselves. But sometimes, the courage to live with our disappointments is the only thing that keeps us human. Story 2. The fluorescent lights in terminal stations of the underground tunnels had been flickering for weeks, casting erratic shadows that danced like restless specters across the yellow tile walls. As the new night security guard, I'd grown accustomed to the symphony of mechanical groans and electrical hums echoing through the abandoned corridors after the last train left at midnight. But tonight, something felt different. A weight pressed against my chest like invisible hands tightening their grasp. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, sharp and narrow, illuminating nothing but peeling paint and cracked tiles. The metal tag on my keychain jingled with every hesitant step, unnaturally loud in the hollow silence that swallowed sound whole. I'd been working this shift for 3 months, yet the station's layout seemed to shift when no one was watching. Corridors stretched longer, corners sharpened, and familiar passages twisted into strange, alien paths that made my skin crawl. Static crackled from my radio as I neared a heavy steel door marked, Platform 0, authorized personnel only. According to my supervisor, that platform had been sealed off since the 1970s after a structural collapse. But tonight, the door stood slightly ajar. My heart hammered against my ribs as cold, stale air seeped through the gap, carrying the musty scent of decades-old decay, and something else. Something electric, like the ozone just before a thunderstorm. Every instinct screamed to call it in, to radio for backup. But my supervisor's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me of the importance of thorough inspections. Trembling, I pushed the door open. The hinges released a long, ear-piercing screech that seemed to announce my arrival to whatever waited beyond. The platform stretched before me, impossibly pristine despite decades of abandonment. Vintage tiles gleamed beneath harsh overhead lights that shouldn't have been working. The air thrummed with an electric current that made the hair on my arms stand on end. My footsteps echoed hollowly, suggesting vast, unseen spaces lurking just beyond the beam of my flashlight. Then I heard it. The distant rumble of a train approaching. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the platform and deep into my bones. My breath hitched in sharp gasps as I stumbled backward toward the door. But my legs felt as if weighted with lead. The rumbling intensified, transforming into a roar that swallowed every other sound, even the frantic pounding of my own heart. The roar filled every corner of my consciousness, drowning out my racing heartbeat and the frantic pounding in my ears. My hands clenched the flashlight tighter, the beam trembling as if it sensed the terror mounting around me. The platform beneath my feet seemed to pulse with the sound, vibrating like the body of some colossal beast stirring in the shadows. I forced my legs to move, stepping away from the door, but the heavy steel frame groaned, and the gap narrowed as if the station itself was closing in on me. The air grew thick, electric, charged with a presence I couldn't see but could feel pressing down, suffocating and immense. A cold wind blew past, carrying whispers, fragments of words I couldn't understand, spoken in a tongue as ancient as the tunnels themselves. My breath fogged in the chill, and I swallowed hard against the rising panic. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging the platform into darkness before harsh fluorescent glare returned, revealing something standing at the far end of the tracks. A figure, shrouded in shadow yet unmistakably human in shape. But as my eyes adjusted, the figure seemed to ripple, its edges blurring, flickering like a broken hologram. I blinked, and it was gone. Yet the air still vibrated with the echo of its presence. My radio crackled sharply, static exploding in my ears before a voice, distorted, fragmented, broke through. "Leave, now." I spun around, fumbling for the radio, but it fell silent, swallowed by the oppressive hum of the station. Heart pounding, I edged toward the exit, every instinct screaming to run. But as I neared the door, a cold hand, impossible, intangible, closed around my wrist. Frozen, I dared not scream. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm of shadows. "Stay. Don't leave. Join us." My vision blurred as the station's walls seemed to ripple and pulse, folding space like the pages of a twisted book. The train's roar crescendoed into a deafening crash that shook the very ground. And then, silence. I was alone. The door stood open, the night air cool and real against my skin. I staggered outside, gasping for breath, the echoes of that underground nightmare chasing me into the dawn. A train emerged from the tunnel's depths, but it was unlike any subway car I'd ever seen. Its sleek black exterior seemed to absorb the surrounding light rather than reflect it, swallowing the faint glow of the platform in an unnatural void. The windows glowed with an ethereal blue radiance so sharp it was painful to look at directly, like cold fire burning through the shadows. The train glided to a perfect stop with barely a sound, as if it existed partially outside the normal laws of physics. The doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, a sigh that whispered secrets in the stillness. Inside, the car stretched impossibly far, an endless corridor lined with subway maps that twisted and curved in patterns that made my eyes water. Routes connected stations with names that felt eerily familiar yet utterly wrong: Regret Junction, Memory Gardens. The intersection of what was. The fluorescent lights pulsed with the same ghostly blue as the windows, casting an otherworldly glow that drained the color from my skin, leaving me pale and fragile looking, as if the light was leeching life itself. An automated announcement crackled through unseen speakers. The voice was unnervingly smooth, devoid of any warmth or humanity. It spoke of departures to destinations that existed nowhere on any official transit map, platforms swallowed by time, and connections to places travelers were never meant to reach by rail. My rational mind screamed warnings, but my feet moved forward as though pulled by invisible strings. The moment I stepped inside, the doors sealed shut with a finality that made my stomach drop like a stone. The train began to move, accelerating smoothly into a darkness thicker than any tunnel should allow. The corridor ahead stretched endlessly, lined with those shifting maps that changed when I wasn't looking directly at them. Red lines bled into blue. Stations vanished and reappeared with different names. Numbers morphed into strange symbols, indecipherable and ancient. My reflection in the window warped and fractured, showing not just my present self, but echoes of who I might have been in different lives, different choices. The announcements continued, each stop named with precision, each evoking fragments of memories that felt both foreign and deeply personal. Childhood neighborhoods I'd never lived in. Schools I'd never attended. Jobs I'd never held. Yet with every whispered description, phantom memories crystallized in my mind, layering over reality like double-exposed photographs, vivid, tangible, yet not my own. The first stop was Sorrow Avenue. The doors slid open to reveal a platform identical to the bus stop where I'd waited for my first job interview 15 years ago. But this memory diverged, a different bus, taking me to a factory job instead of the office position I'd earned. The scent of industrial oil filled the air, and I felt the ache in my back from endless hours of manual labor. The weight in my chest tightened. This was no mere journey through space, it was a voyage through the roads not taken, the lives unlived. Each stop threatened to overwrite the story I'd truly lived. At Loneliness Terminal, I recalled years spent isolated in a cramped apartment, the woman I'd never married, a stranger whose face I could no longer place. At Failure Heights, my college graduation faded into a sequence of academic disappointments and jobs that had slipped through my fingers. I pressed my hands to my temples, desperate to hold on to the truth. But the false memories were as vivid and concrete as any real experience. The train pulsed around me, its walls growing more complex, maps weaving an intricate web of choices and lost possibilities. The voice asked again, calm, insistent, requesting my confirmation to accept this alternate history as my own. I felt my real life slipping away with every mile deeper into this impossible system. The voice's insistence grew, a soothing yet relentless murmur weaving through the pulsing blue light. It sought my surrender, a quiet agreement to abandon the fractured reality I'd known and embrace this shimmering tapestry of might-have-beens. But the grip of those phantom memories was tightening, threatening to smother the fragile thread that tethered me to my true self. I clenched my fists, the nails biting into my palms as I fought to resist the seductive pull. Every fiber of my being screamed to hold on, to the imperfect, the painful, the real. The train continued to speed through the infinite darkness, approaching the final stop, Oblivion Gate. The name sent a shiver crawling down my spine. The announcement echoed softly, the voice more somber, almost mournful. Oblivion Gate, the final junction. Choose your path. As the train slowed, the walls seemed to breathe, shadows stretching and folding like living things. The lights flickered, casting grotesque shapes dancing along the corridor. The doors hissed open, revealing a platform unlike any before. It was a vast void, a swirling mist where reality and memory tangled. Figures moved just beyond the fog, faces blurred, voices fragmented, a haunting crowd trapped between worlds. The air was thick with sorrow and longing. A figure stepped forward from the haze, the dark-haired woman from my visions. Her eyes held a gentle plea, an invitation to join the endless parade of lost souls wandering this liminal space. I felt the weight of 1,000 lives, dreams surrendered, potential devoured. A choice lay before me, stark and unyielding. Step through Oblivion Gate and dissolve into the perfect illusions, leaving behind the messy truth of who I was. Or turn away, clutching the fragile light of my flawed reality, uncertain but undeniably mine. My breath caught as the mist curled around my feet, beckoning. And in that suspended moment, I made my choice. Sweat dripped down my spine as I scrutinized the maps, desperate for a clue to escape this living nightmare. The route lines traced serpentine patterns, twisting, overlapping routes that felt almost familiar, like a transit system conjured in a fevered dream. Then my breath caught cold in my throat. One map showed a line connecting to Platform 0, not as a starting point, but as the final destination. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. This wasn't a random journey through alternate possibilities. The train was following a fixed route, steering me inevitably toward Platform 0, the place where it intended to deposit whatever was left of me after stripping away everything that defined who I truly was. But with that understanding came hope. If this was a transit system, no matter how impossible, it must obey rules. There had to be connections, detours, and ways to navigate through its maze. I began to study the map systematically, pushing back the phantom memories that crowded my mind. Each station represented a crossroads in my life, a moment where I could have turned down a different path. The train wanted me to confirm these alternate histories, to accept them as my true story. Yet hidden beneath the tangled web of false routes were faint traces of the path I had actually taken, the real journey of my life. At the next stop, Compromised Corner, the train attempted to overwrite my memory with a vision of failure and defeat. But I fought back. I focused on the memory it tried to erase, the promotion I had earned through grit and persistence, the quiet pride in overcoming doubt and proving my worth. The train shuddered as I clung tightly to this truth, refusing to relinquish it. The announcements grew urgent, the dispassionate voice losing its calm veneer. Confirm your path. But I shook my head, voice steady despite the turmoil. No. That's not my life. The maps flickered wildly. Some phantom routes faded and vanished as I rejected their falsehood. The train's smooth, silent progress became erratic, as if my defiance had broken its perfect algorithm. At Regret Junction, the train offered a vision of a life mired in self-recrimination. I countered with memories of quiet joy, simple evenings with friends, small victories, moments of peace untouched by grandeur or failure. The struggle drained me. Each real memory was a fragile lifeline, like trying to hold water in cupped hands amid a storm. But slowly, I sensed the train weakening. The impossible maps blinked more often, phantom stations disappearing from the walls. Finally, the announcement ceased. Only the gentle sound of motion remained, not oppressive silence, but the calm before dawn. When the train stopped, I found myself back at Platform 0. But now I saw it clearly. Not an abandoned ruin, but a nexus, where possibility and reality intertwined. This was the system's sorting ground, where it assigned people to the lives they should have lived, rather than the ones they chose. The doors slid open, and I stepped onto the platform with legs trembling but steady. Behind me, the train faded, becoming translucent before vanishing entirely. The impossible maps dissolved from the walls, taking with them every phantom route and alternative destiny. I walked back through the familiar corridors, the jingling of my keychain a soothing reminder of reality reclaimed. But as I continued my rounds, the knowledge of what I'd experienced gnawed at me relentlessly. Somewhere deep within the transit system, that train was still running, still carrying passengers on journeys designed to replace their authentic lives with carefully crafted alternatives. My radio crackled with normal static, and the fluorescent lights flickered in their erratic dance. Everything appeared exactly as it had before I found Platform 0. But now I understood, normal was precious, fragile and needing constant vigilance to protect. In a world where reality itself could be questioned, where false memories could feel more vivid than true experience, the simple act of remembering who you really were became an act of rebellion. The next morning, as my shift ended and commuters flooded the station, I watched them move through their routines with an ease and certainty that sparked a strange mixture of envy and dread. They trusted completely in the solid reality of their daily lives. But I had glimpsed what hid beneath that familiar surface, and I knew not all journeys led where official maps promised. From that night on, I made it my mission to double-check every sealed door, every supposedly abandoned platform. Because I'd learned that the most dangerous destinations were often those offering exactly what you'd always longed for. Story 3. The fluorescent lights in Hartwell Corporate Center always hummed with a frequency that crawled beneath my skin. But tonight, that drone felt different, hungrier somehow, as if the building itself was feeding on the silence that had settled over its 43 floors of empty offices. I'd been the night janitor here for 8 years, long enough to know every creak, every shadow, every odd quirk this glass and steel monument held. But I'd never noticed the elevator panel had a button marked B4 until tonight. My flashlight sliced through the darkness as I approached the elevator bank on the main floor, keys jingling softly against my belt. The daytime bustle had long since faded, leaving only the whispers of ventilation systems and distant hums of machinery buried deep in the building's bowels. Through countless late-night rounds, I'd always assumed the parking garage descended only 3 levels, B1, B2, and B3. Yet here was the B4 button, slightly tarnished, as if hidden behind some invisible veil that had only just lifted. My throat tightened as I stared at it. 8 years riding this elevator, and I would have sworn on my life that it hadn't been there yesterday. My rational mind offered explanations. Maybe the building always had a 4th basement, for storage or utilities. Maybe the button was covered or out of order. Maybe I simply never noticed. But my gut churned with an instinctive wrongness that made my skin crawl. The elevator chimed softly and arrived. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the polished floor. My finger hovered over the B4 button, trembling slightly, as if my body was warning me. The metal was ice-cold beneath my fingertip as I pressed it. The button glowed a sickly yellow, different from the clean white lights marking other floors. The descent lasted longer than usual. The floor indicators ticked past B1, B2, and B3, then the elevator dropped further with a grinding sound I'd never heard before. My ears popped with the pressure change, and the temperature plummeted. The fluorescent strip above flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows that made the cramped space feel claustrophobic. My heart pounded as the elevator shuddered to a stop with a metallic screech that grated my nerves raw. The doors slid open agonizingly slow. Before me stretched a parking garage that defied every law of architecture and common sense. The space extended far beyond the building's footprint, swallowing light and stretching into shadows my flashlight couldn't pierce. I stepped cautiously out of the elevator, every instinct in my body screaming at me to retreat, to press the closed door button and forget B4 had ever existed. But curiosity is a quiet kind of gravity. It pulls harder the more you try to resist it. The concrete beneath my boots felt damp, almost soft, as if the ground had been soaking in moisture, or something worse, for decades. Faint tire marks crisscrossed the floor, but they twisted in nonsensical patterns, spiraling in ways no car could have physically driven. The air was colder here, and wrong. It wasn't just the chill, it was the stillness. Not the silence of an empty space, but the breathless hush of something holding its breath in the dark. I swung my flashlight to the left. Nothing. To the right, the beam caught a sign bolted to one of the support pillars. Its paint had peeled and faded, but I could still read the word stenciled in that distinct corporate font. Level B4, Archive Transit Access. Transit? I frowned. This building wasn't connected to any subway line. We were blocks away from the nearest station, and no one had ever mentioned underground access. But something about the word archive made the hair on the back of my neck bristle. As I moved deeper into the space, the walls began to change. At first, they were the standard raw concrete of most parking garages. But then strange patterns emerged, subtle, pulsing lines beneath the surface, like veins beneath skin. The deeper I went, the more organic the structure became, until the pillars seemed less like construction supports and more like bones. My flashlight dimmed. Not because the batteries were dying, but because the darkness here felt active. Like it was pushing back. I turned a corner and stopped cold. There, resting in a patch of light from a flickering overhead bulb, was a car, an old model sedan, 1980s maybe. Dustless. Pristine. Like it had just rolled off the factory line. And someone was sitting inside. I couldn't see their face, only the back of a head, motionless, staring straight ahead. I raised my flashlight and slowly circled toward the driver's side. But when the beam passed the front windshield, the car was empty. I blinked. Looked again. Still empty. But I had seen them. I knew I had. A sudden metallic clang echoed from behind me. I spun around, breath caught in my throat. One of the massive ventilation grates along the far wall had fallen open, the sound of its impact still vibrating in my chest. From the gaping vent, a whisper rolled out. Not quite words, but something close. It sounded like someone mimicking human speech. Or trying to remember how. Then the lights overhead began to hum louder. Not flicker, hum. Building, resonating, like a frequency shaking loose something buried. The flashlight sputtered, casting erratic arcs of light across the walls. For a split second, I saw shapes, tall, elongated figures standing just at the edge of visibility. Not moving. Just watching. I staggered backward, heart slamming against my ribs, nearly dropping the light. The air thickened, vibrating in my ears with something just below the level of sound, like pressure before a thunderclap. And then, a voice. Right behind me. Whispering, clear this time. You found it, too early. The voice sliced through the heavy silence like a cold blade. I spun around, flashlight shaking wildly in my grip, but the corridor behind me was empty, only the echo of my own ragged breathing and the faint hum of those unseen machines. You found it, too early, the whisper repeated, softer now, almost regretful. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I strained my eyes into the darkness, but saw nothing, only shadows pooling and shifting like living ink. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, as if the space itself was closing in, squeezing the warmth from my lungs. Instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they'd turned to stone. Then, from somewhere deep within the labyrinthine garage, a low, grinding noise began, a distant mechanical groan that grew steadily louder, resonating through the concrete bones of the building. The walls around me seemed to pulse, veins of shadow snaking beneath the surface, twisting and writhing in slow, hypnotic rhythm. I backed away, desperate to find the elevator, to escape this impossible place, but the corridors now folded upon themselves, bending space in ways that made no sense. Doors appeared where none had been moments before, stairwells spiraled down into darkness so thick it felt like swallowing cold smoke. The whisper came again, closer this time, a breath against my ear. You shouldn't be here. This place is not for the living. Panic surged. I turned and ran, the flashlight beam darting wildly as I sprinted down winding passages that seemed endless. Behind me, the mechanical groan swelled into a cacophony, metal grinding against metal, echoing with a sinister pulse. My breath came in ragged gasps. The walls seemed to close in, shadows reaching out like grasping fingers. Just as exhaustion threatened to collapse me, I burst through a heavy steel door and into an empty loading bay flooded with harsh white light. The sudden brightness stabbed my eyes. I staggered forward, the noises behind me fading as the door slammed shut. Heart pounding, I collapsed against a concrete pillar, gasping for air, the surreal nightmare of before receding like a dark tide. But deep in my mind, the voice lingered. You found it, too early. And I knew the building, the train, the impossible stations, they were all waiting. Waiting for the next one. The ceiling hung low and oppressive, supported by concrete pillars slick with moisture and coated in a fine layer of ash-like dust. The air carried a musty, metallic tang that clung to my tongue, making every breath feel heavy and labored. Rows upon rows of cars filled the space, vehicles that belonged to another era. Massive sedans from the 1950s sat alongside boxy station wagons from the 1970s. Their chrome bumpers were dulled and pitted, long forgotten beneath decades of neglect. Every surface was dusted with that same ghostly gray powder, as if time itself had wrapped this place in a silent shroud. The license plates told stories of the past, bearing dates from 60 to 70 years ago, some so corroded the numbers were barely legible. My boots crunched softly against the gritty floor as I stepped off the elevator, my flashlight beam darting across the eerie tableau of abandoned vehicles. The silence pressed in like a physical weight, crushing my eardrums with its absolute stillness. Not even the usual hum of machinery or ventilation penetrated this subterranean tomb. The only sound was my breathing, unnervingly loud in the stifling quiet. As I ventured deeper, unease curling like ice in my veins, my beam landed on a spot about 50 feet away. There, parked as if waiting for me, was my own Honda Civic. The same license plate. The same dent in the rear bumper from a careless scrape 2 years ago. The same faded air freshener dangling from the rearview mirror. But this car was a relic, ravaged by time. Rust clawed through the once forest green paint, leaving angry orange scars. The tires were flat and cracked like ancient leather. The windshield spiderwebbed with fractures, the air freshener faded into unrecognizable gray. Peering through the driver's side window, I saw the interior match the decay outside, the fabric of the seats rotted away, the dashboard warped and cracked. Dust coated every surface, the same fine gray film suffusing this impossible place. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. The moment I pulled, it snapped off with a sharp crack of corroded metal that echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous garage. In response, speakers hidden in the shadows crackled to life, releasing a burst of static that made me jump and nearly drop my flashlight. A voice emerged, pleasant, professional, like an automated customer service line, but beneath its cheerful veneer lurked something deeply unsettling. It calmly informed me that I had accumulated substantial parking fees during my extended stay in their facility. The debt, it said, had been compounding for quite some time. Immediate payment was required to avoid further penalties. I tried to protest, to explain the mistake. I had just arrived, but my voice barely escaped my lips as a hoarse whisper, smothered by the thick, suffocating air. The speaker crackled again. This time the tone shifted subtly, still polite but with an insistent edge. My parking debt, it stated, stood at several decades worth of fees, interest, and penalties. If payment was not rendered immediately, the debt would begin converting into my personal timeline, accelerating its claim on my life itself. The implications hit me like a blow to the chest. My knees buckled, and I grasped the nearest car for support, my palms pressing against metal so cold it burned through my skin. The conversion process, the voice explained with eerie cheerfulness, would continue until the debt was paid or until I found the proper exit procedures. Time was running out, it added, almost as if it found amusement in my growing panic. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Breath came in sharp, ragged gasps that echoed off the concrete walls. Sweat poured down my face despite the cold air, and my hands shook so uncontrollably I struggled to keep hold of my flashlight. I was trapped in a debt that devoured time itself. And the clock was ticking. The heavy weight of impending doom pressed relentlessly on my chest as I forced myself to move. Clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, I staggered away from the rusted car, each step echoing hollowly against the cavernous walls. My mind raced. If this place fed on time itself, then escape wasn't just a matter of physical distance, it was a battle against the very fabric of my existence. The faint hum of the speakers had faded, replaced by an almost imperceptible whispering carried on the stale air, voices layered and distant, like echoes trapped beneath layers of forgotten years. They seemed to seep from the concrete itself, murmuring debts, regrets, and forgotten promises. I needed a way out. My eyes scanned the endless rows of relic vehicles and crumbling pillars, desperate for a sign, an exit, a staircase, anything. And then, at the far edge of the garage, faint flickers of light shimmered, irregular, like a weak beacon struggling against the darkness. Summoning every ounce of courage, I moved toward the glow. The air grew colder still, every breath crystallizing in my lungs. Shadows lengthened unnaturally as the space seemed to stretch and warp, confusing my senses and bending reality itself. The deeper I ventured, the more the boundaries between the past and present blurred. I thought I glimpsed figures in vintage clothing wandering between the cars, ghosts of the forgotten, trapped in this mausoleum of lost time. Suddenly, a chill swept past me, and the distant metallic clang echoed again, this time closer, urgent. My heart seized. I wasn't alone. Something unseen was moving toward me, something patient, relentless, feeding on the debt I could never repay. The faint light grew brighter until I stood before a heavy steel door, its surface etched with symbols that pulsed faintly, ancient runes intertwined with mechanical cogs. The door's edges shimmered as if woven from shadows and light. With trembling hands, I pushed it open. Beyond lay a narrow staircase spiraling upward, a slender thread of hope climbing out of the abyss. The whispering voices crescendoed into a roar, threatening to drag me back into the consuming darkness. I stepped onto the first stair, the cold stone biting into my boots. With every step, the oppressive weight lessened, the air clearing. Behind me, the pulsating symbols on the door flickered, then faded to dull iron. As I emerged into the sterile, fluorescent-lit basement of the building, the normal hum of ventilation systems and distant traffic greeted me like a bomb. The nightmare below was sealed away once more, for now. But in my pocket, the metallic jingle of my keys sounded heavier, as if burdened by unseen chains. And in the recesses of my mind, I knew this was no final escape. The debt lingered. The clock was still ticking. And somewhere, in the shadows between moments, the parking garage waited patiently for its next visitor. The beam wavered weakly across the rows of dusty, forgotten cars, each one a silent testament to decades of imprisonment in this subterranean purgatory. My legs buckled beneath me, rubbery and unwilling to support the weight of my desperation as I stumbled backward toward the elevator's last known location. But where the elevator doors should have stood, there was nothing but unbroken concrete, smooth, unyielding, and seemingly poured decades ago to erase any trace of escape. My fists slammed into the cold wall until knuckles cracked and bled, but only hollow thuds answered me, swallowed by the oppressive silence that suffocated the space. Suddenly, the speakers crackled to life again, the voice colder now, losing the artificial politeness it once had. Impatience crept in. The conversion process has begun, it intoned, and I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest, as if the years were being siphoned from my very life force with each passing second. My hair felt coarser and thinner beneath my trembling fingers. When I looked down, my skin sagged, weathered and loose, the flashlight's beam flickering over hands that no longer felt like mine. Desperation propelled me deeper into the maze. My footsteps echoed off the low ceiling as I hunted for any sign of an exit. The cars stretched endlessly in all directions, corroded metal and shattered glass intertwining in an impossible labyrinth. Some were so ancient, they belonged to a forgotten era, Model T Fords with wooden spoked wheels, massive Packards with running boards, relics from a time before this building could have even existed. The temperature plunged further, my breath forming fragile clouds in the frigid air. The concrete beneath my boots felt like solid ice, numbing my feet, while my fingers clenched the flashlight with a desperate grip. The fine gray dust coating every surface began to swirl around me, stirred by an invisible current that made each breath a labor. Behind me, illogical sounds crept through the gloom, weak engines grinding futile attempts at ignition, radio static crackling from broken speakers hidden within rusted vehicles, the soft whisper of tires on concrete. I whirled, flashlight slicing the darkness, but all I saw were endless rows of silent, dust-choked cars. Yet the sounds grew louder, more insistent. The speakers crackled once more, the voice stripped of all civility. Payment is past due. Conversion accelerating. I felt the truth of those words in every aching joint, in the dimming edges of my vision, in the increasing effort required to pull breath into my lungs. My search became frantic, fueled by terror and fading strength. I squeezed between cars, clambered over hoods and trunks, peered beneath rusted chassis, searching desperately for any sign of salvation. But the garage seemed alive, reshaping itself in cruel mockery. Passages once clear became barricaded by vehicles that had materialized out of nowhere. Rows twisted back on themselves in impossible loops, mocking my futile escape. And then, at the very edge of my flickering flashlight's reach, a faint, trembling hope appeared. A small door, painted institutional green like the emergency exits I'd seen so many times before, nestled between two massive support pillars. Above it, a sign glowed faintly, the word exit shimmering in wavering red light. The journey toward that door stretched endlessly. My legs, heavy and stiff, moved with the uncertain gait of someone far older than their years. My breathing was ragged, wheezing through cracked lungs, each heartbeat a fading drum in the cavernous silence. The flashlight trembled in my grasp, casting wild shadows that danced and taunted as I staggered onward. At last, I reached the door. My shaking hands barely managed to grasp the cold metal handle. The chill burned through my palm, but with a final surge, I pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling upward into darkness, a slender thread of hope winding toward salvation. The narrow staircase stretched upward before me, its walls slick with moisture that dripped slowly into unseen depths. Each step echoed hollowly, the sound swallowed quickly by the darkness above. The stale, cold air rose in a thin, biting column, carrying with it the faintest hint of something metallic, a scent that prickled at my senses and tightened my throat. My hands gripped the railing, slick and cold, as I ascended with trembling legs. The further I climbed, the more the oppressive weight below seemed to lift, replaced by a growing tension, as if the air itself was charged, holding its breath. At intervals, the stairwell twisted sharply, forcing me to turn and peer into the black void beyond. Shadows shifted at the edges of my vision, flickering like the remnants of forgotten memories. I quickened my pace, heart hammering, breath shallow. Halfway up, a faint glow appeared ahead, soft and pulsing like a heartbeat. The walls began to change from rough concrete to polished steel panels, cold and smooth beneath my fingertips. The scent shifted too, metallic now, sterile, almost clinical. Reaching the top, I found a heavy door emblazoned with the faint insignia of Hartwell Corporate Center. It slid open silently as I approached, revealing a brightly lit corridor that contrasted starkly with the darkness I'd left behind. But the corridor was empty. No hum of ventilation, no distant footsteps, just an eerie silence punctuated by the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. The walls were lined with framed photographs, faces blurred and distorted, images of people who seemed both familiar and alien. As I stepped forward, the door slammed shut behind me with a resonant boom, locking tight. The lights flickered, and a chill ran down my spine. A voice, clear, smooth, and devoid of warmth, echoed through hidden speakers. "Welcome to Level B4, where time folds and memories converge. Your journey has just begun." The steps were so steep and narrow they seemed to disappear into the shadows above. Beside the doorframe, a faded red sign bore simple instructions. Emergency exit, time debt forgiveness program, present valid parking ticket for processing. My fingers trembled as I pulled my wallet from my pocket. It felt thick and unfamiliar in my hand. Inside, tucked behind my driver's license, was a parking ticket I'd never seen before. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded to a brittle brown, yet the validation stamp was clear. 8 years, 7 months, 13 days. The exact length of time I'd worked at Hartwell Corporate Center. The speakers crackled one final time as I fed the ticket into a small slot beside the doorframe. The voice that emerged was different now, older, wearier, tinged with what might have been relief. Debt acknowledged and processed. Cleared for departure. Conversion process will be reversed upon exit. Please note, experience serves as reminder to attend to terms and conditions of extended parking. Each step up the narrow staircase was an agonizing effort. My legs shook violently, my lungs burned with every labored breath. But with every movement upward, strength returned. My vision sharpened, my breathing eased. The crushing weight of years lifted from my shoulders like a tangible burden removed. I emerged through a door I'd walked past thousands of times, a maintenance entrance on the ground floor I'd always assumed led only to utility closets. The familiar hum of the building's nighttime routine flooded my ears, fluorescent lights buzzing softly, ventilation systems whispering through ducts, the distant rumble of elevators carrying phantom passengers between floors. My reflection caught in the polished lobby windows. It showed a man exactly as he had at the start of his shift, no new lines etched into his face, no streaks of gray in his hair, no stiffness in his joints. But my eyes held something new, a knowledge forged in impossible places. The understanding that some debts compound in ways beyond mere numbers, that attention to detail can mean the difference between freedom and a lifetime trapped beneath unseen obligations. The elevator panel showed only 3 basement levels. B1, B2, and B3 glowed with familiar white lights. No trace remained of the tarnished button marked B4. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still hear the faint crackle of speakers buried deep beneath the building's foundation. And I know somewhere in the shadows below, cars continue to collect dust. Time continues to compound interest on debts their owners never knew they'd incurred. I park on the street now, feeding meters with careful attention to expiration times, never letting validation tickets lapse without proper processing. Some lessons, learned in the depths of impossible places, become permanent fixtures in the architecture of survival. Story 4. And the mountains have their own language. I should have listened when they whispered warnings that October morning. 23 years guiding climbers up these peaks, and never before had I felt the stone beneath my boots pulse with such malevolent intent. But corporate money talks louder than mountain whispers. Henderson Industries was paying triple my usual rate to get their 2 executives to the Whitmore Plateau before the seasonal storms hit. I should have turned back when my weather radio began picking up broadcasts from stations that didn't exist. My name is Marcus Webb. Though by the end of this account, I'm not entirely certain that name still belongs to me. The morning had started normal enough. Loading gear into my pack. Checking crampons. Reviewing the route maps with Jameson and Carter, the 2 Henderson executives who'd hired me for what they called a team-building expedition. They wore their corporate confidence like expensive cologne, masking the acrid scent of fear that clings to city men who venture into wild places. The air was crisp, carrying that sharp, biting edge only autumn in the high mountains can bring. The sun was still low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the rocky trail as we set off toward Whitmore Plateau. Jameson and Carter moved confidently, their expensive gear gleaming, smiles forced but determined. I tried to steady their nerves, sharing stories of previous climbs, but beneath their polished exteriors, I sensed a restless unease that no pep talk could dispel. The mountains seemed to watch us. The wind whispered in patterns that felt less like natural gusts and more like warnings wrapped in ancient language, words only the stones and trees could understand. My weather radio crackled sporadically, picking up fragments of broadcasts in static and languages I didn't recognize. Stations with names that sent a chill down my spine, places that didn't exist on any map. As we ascended, the terrain grew harsher, the path narrowing and twisting through jagged outcrops slick with frost. The sky darkened rapidly, thick clouds rolling in with unnatural speed. A storm was coming, and it wasn't one born of weather. At night, the wind's voice grew louder, weaving through our tents with mournful cries that kept sleep elusive. Shadows danced just beyond the firelight, and the stars overhead seemed to flicker and pulse as if breathing. Jameson began to change. His confident facade cracked, revealing glimpses of panic and whispered conversations with invisible figures. Carter, ever pragmatic, refused to speak of the noises or the strange lights flickering beyond the ridge. On the 3rd day, as we approached the plateau, the ground itself seemed to pulse beneath my boots, a subtle vibration that quickened my heartbeat. The mountains were no longer silent witnesses but active participants, watchers with ancient grudges. And then I saw it. A shape, enormous and indistinct, moving just beyond the tree line, a shifting silhouette that defied description. Its presence pressed down like a weight on my chest, a reminder that some places are sacred, and some secrets are best left buried beneath stone and silence. The climb had become a journey into the unknown, where the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred. And I wasn't sure which would claim me first, the mountain or the men I was guiding. Jameson kept checking his satellite phone every 5 minutes as if the mountain might suddenly sprout cell towers to accommodate his important calls. Carter studied the topographic maps with the intensity of a man trying to memorize an escape route, though he claimed fascination with the terrain. Neither seemed particularly interested in my warnings about the weather patterns I'd been observing, the unusual cloud formations, the way the wind carried sounds that didn't match any animal I knew. We began the ascent at dawn, our headlamps carving narrow paths through a darkness reluctant to yield. The familiar weight of my pack felt wrong, as if the straps tightened on their own. My water bottles rattled with a rhythm that matched no step I took. I chalked it up to pre-climb jitters, though I'd never experienced anything like it. The first 3 hours passed without incident. We followed the standard approach to Whitmore, a route I could navigate blindfolded. But as we gained elevation, unsettling details piled up, making my skin crawl. The rock face bore scratch marks too regular to be natural erosion, too deep for any known animal in these mountains. When I mentioned this to Carter, he laughed nervously, suggesting bears, though none could carve 6-inch grooves into granite. By midday, we reached the base of the final approach to the plateau. It was then the radio began acting up. Static filled the channels, but beneath the white noise, voices emerged. They spoke of weather patterns predating recorded history. A broadcaster, his voice like grinding stone, reported a cold front building for 6 centuries, moving south from polar regions uncharted by cartographers. Another, speaking in archaic English, warned of snows falling upward and storms moving backward through time. Jameson insisted these were historical reenactments. Carter blamed atmospheric interference causing signals to bounce oddly off peaks. I wanted to believe them, but the voices spoke with the authority of witnesses, not actors reading scripts. The temperature plummeted faster than altitude alone would explain. My breath formed puffs that lingered too long, as if the atmosphere thickened. Jameson's high-tech gear emitted impossible sounds, his jacket zipper whistled notes forming near melodies, his boots squeaked on stone in patterns resembling Morse code. We reached the plateau just as the first flakes began to fall. I've seen mountain weather turn deadly in minutes, but nothing prepared me for snow that burned like molten metal. The flakes struck exposed skin with the searing pain of hot coals. Yet when brushed away, they remained solid, refusing to melt despite the heat they caused. Carter cried out as one struck his cheek, leaving a brand-like red mark. Jameson pulled his hood tight, suggesting immediate shelter, though his voice trembled with growing fear. The plateau stretched before us like a vast landing strip carved from ice and stone. Normally offering spectacular views, visibility now dropped to mere feet as the burning snow fell heavier. The wind carried sounds that made no sense, chimes where howling should have been, whispers in unknown tongues, and beneath it all, a low thrumming as if the mountain itself breathed. While unpacking the emergency shelter, Carter grabbed my arm and pointed through the swirling snow. A structure emerged from the white curtain like a ship from fog. A cabin, impossibly ancient, with no record of construction on this remote plateau. Its architecture spoke of an era when these peaks were considered impassable. The cabin stood like a silent sentinel, its weathered timbers blackened by decades of storms and time itself. Its windows were dark, eyes staring blankly into the swirling white void. As we approached, an unnatural stillness descended, a silence so profound it swallowed the howling wind and the crackling of burning snowflakes. The air grew thick, heavy with a presence that seemed older than the mountains themselves. My skin prickled, hair standing on end as if unseen fingers brushed against my neck. The low thrumming beneath the snow intensified, vibrating through the soles of my boots, sinking with the pounding of my heart. Jameson's confident facade shattered as he whispered, "This place, it's alive." Carter's usual skepticism faltered, eyes darting nervously to shadows that seemed to shift and flicker just beyond the shelter of the cabin's walls. I felt it too, a pulse beneath the earth, a breathing rhythm not of this world. The mountain was watching, waiting. From the swirling mist, faint shapes began to emerge. They were neither fully formed nor entirely spectral, ghostly figures bound to the rock and ice, caught between worlds. Faces etched with sorrow, hands reaching out, as if pleading for release or warning intruders away. The whispers returned, rising on the wind like mournful chants in an ancient tongue. I could not understand the words, but the feeling was unmistakable. This was a place of power and pain, where the boundary between the living and the dead blurred. The cabin door creaked open slowly, as if beckoning us inside. A cold, unnatural draft escaped, a breath from another time. Inside, the air was impossibly cold, carrying scents of earth and decay mingled with faint traces of smoke. Old symbols adorned the walls, carved runes that seemed to writhe and shift when caught in the flicker of our flashlights. In the corner, a stone altar covered in frost bore offerings of worn tools, fragments of cloth, and what looked disturbingly like bones. Suddenly, the low thrumming exploded into a crescendo, shaking the cabin as unseen forces surged. The mountain's voice, ancient and terrible, filled the air, an echo that resonated deep within our souls. We were trespassers in a sacred realm, caught in the crossfire of an age-old struggle between nature and something far darker. And as the snow burned harder against our skin, I realized the mountain's secrets were not meant for us to uncover. The cabin was built from dark wood that seemed to swallow what little light filtered through the relentless storm. Every visible surface was carved deep with symbols, spirals that made your eyes ache to follow, angular patterns suggesting a written language but belonging to no alphabet I'd ever seen, and interlocking designs that shifted subtly when caught from the corner of your eye. Above the door, the most prominent symbol resembled a sun encircled by text in that same unknowable script, glowing faintly as if alive. Carter suggested we investigate, reasoning that any shelter was preferable to the burning snow that continued to fall like molten shards. Jameson agreed, though his eyes darted repeatedly to his satellite phone, now displaying error messages in unfamiliar fonts, alien and unsettling. Every instinct in me screamed to stay away, but the alternative, exposure to an unnatural storm that defied every law of nature, was worse. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing a darkness more solid than mere absence of light. As we drew near, I noticed the burning snow melted instantly where it touched the cabin's roof, creating a faint steam that curled upward, an impossible microclimate, a haven from the frozen hell outside. The symbols carved into the wood grew sharper and more distinct. Unease prickled my skin as I realized some of the lines moved, flowing, twisting, reforming into new patterns. Spirals tightened and loosened. Text rearranged itself, shifting meaning before my eyes. Inside, the cabin contained a single room furnished with items from no consistent era. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel etched with the same pulsating symbols. Victorian furniture sat beside medieval tapestries depicting scenes of eternal summer, harvest festivals under blazing suns, people clad lightly, dancing in fields of golden grain. But the most disturbing feature was a large mirror mounted on the far wall. Its surface did not reflect us. Instead, it showed the cabin's exterior, our arrival replayed endlessly in a hypnotic loop. Carter found a journal resting on the central table, its pages filled with entries in multiple handwritings and languages. Some were in English, chronicling expeditions to this plateau spanning over 2 centuries. Others were written in the shifting script that adorned the cabin itself. The most recent English entry, dated 3 weeks prior, was penned by someone named David Marsh. He described discovering the cabin during a storm of burning snow, reading the journal, and learning of the choice offered by the symbols above the door. According to Marsh, the symbols promised escape from the eternal winter engulfing the world, a trade. Surrender your true name. Accept a name inscribed in their script. Walk into eternal summer, while someone else takes your place in the frozen wasteland. Marsh wrote of seeing, in the mirror, those who had made the trade, living in warm places, while others suffered the cold they'd abandoned. His final entry consisted of a single, haunting line. I am no longer David Marsh. Beneath it, symbols burned bright, too painful to look at directly. Jameson called out from the fireplace. Among fresh ashes, he'd found partially burned identification cards, driver's licenses, and credit cards. At least a dozen different identities, each belonging to those who had visited and chosen to burn their former selves away. Carter stared into the mirror with horrified fascination. He described images of sunny beaches, bustling cities, people living comfortable lives where snow never fell. He saw himself in those scenes, but dressed differently, answering to another name. The cabin's temperature rose despite the raging storm outside. The symbols pulsed with growing light, warmth spreading through the room like a living thing. I understood then. The cabin was offering us the choice David Marsh had written about. Surrender our names. Our identities. Accept new ones, written in the symbolic script. And step through the mirror into eternal summer. The cabin's power was older than any of us could have imagined, woven into the very fabric of the mountain, a secret older than the first footsteps that dared cross the plateau. Legends whispered among the native people spoke of a place where the veil between worlds thinned, a sacred threshold where seasons and time folded upon themselves, and the earth's breath carried promises and curses alike. The symbols carved into the cabin's timbers were no mere decoration. They were sigils of binding and transformation, ancient scripts used to barter with forces beyond human reckoning. These runes formed a language older than any tongue known to man, a dialect spoken in the silence between heartbeats, in the shifting shadows cast by firelight, in the pulse of stone and root. The sun symbol above the door was not simply a sign of warmth or light. It was a seal, an emblem of the eternal pact made long ago between mortal souls and the mountain's insatiable hunger. The cabin itself was a vessel, a crucible where identities were shed like old skin and reforged in a new, otherworldly image. Each visitor drawn here came bearing debts, not just of time or money, but of existence itself. The mountain fed on these debts, consuming memories and names, and in return offered a twisted salvation. Surrender your true self, it promised, and receive a new life bathed in eternal summer, free from the ravages of cold and time. But this was no gift. It was a curse disguised in comfort, a bargain that demanded sacrifice beyond mere flesh. The mirror was the gateway, reflecting not reality but possibility, showing those who gazed upon it the seductive allure of what might be, luring them toward oblivion. Those who accepted the trade vanished from the frozen world, their names erased, replaced by runes that bound them forever to the mountain's will. Their former selves trapped in endless winter, shadows among the dust-covered relics, their stories whispered only in ash and faded ink. The warmth growing within the cabin was not natural. It was the pulse of the mountain's hunger, an energy born of stolen time and stolen souls. As the light of the symbols brightened, it drew the living closer to the threshold, testing their resolve. To choose was to sever a bond with the world one knew, stepping into a realm of endless light but eternal exile. The mountain's power was a paradox, both prison and sanctuary, predator and guardian. And the cabin stood at its heart, a silent sentinel to the endless cycle of surrender and rebirth. The history of those who made the choice before us was etched not only in the ashes by the fireplace or the faded pages of David Marsh's journal but in the very soul of the mountain itself. Centuries ago, long before the first wooden beams of the cabin were hewn, the plateau was considered a place of both reverence and fear by indigenous peoples. They spoke of restless spirits, ancestors caught between worlds, bound by bargains forged in desperation. The earliest records, scattered and cryptic, told of travelers lost to the eternal winter, who returned transformed, or not at all. As the ages passed, explorers and settlers who dared the plateau found signs of the cabin's eerie influence, forgotten campsites, burned offerings, cryptic carvings left half-buried beneath snow and stone. Each entry in the cabin's journal was a fragment of a long chain, men and women who arrived burdened by debts of the past, of life and time, lured by whispered promises of escape and renewal. There was Eleanor Finch, a botanist from the late 1800s, whose entry spoke of scientific curiosity twisted into obsession. She wrote of seeing the cabin through a blizzard, drawn by visions of a spring that never ended. Her final words faded into strange symbols, and local legends say she vanished, her name replaced by one that no tongue could speak. Then came the miners of the early 20th century, desperate men escaping ruined lives in the valleys below. They found the cabin as a refuge from snowstorms that lasted years. Some took the trade, shedding their names like coats, stepping into lives warmed by the sun in faraway places. Their abandoned tools and scorched possessions were left as silent testimonies in the ashes. During the Great Depression, families fleeing poverty stumbled onto the plateau. One father, Thomas Whitaker, wrote of the unbearable cold that threatened his children's lives and the choice that tore his soul apart. His final entry was a plea, for forgiveness or perhaps understanding, that ended in a scrawl of the shifting runes. More recent visitors, like David Marsh, continued the pattern, drawn by hope, desperation, or a restless yearning for something more than their frozen realities. Each had traded their true names for ones inscribed in the arcane script, stepping into mirrored lives of warmth and light. But the cost was eternal. Those who remained in the frozen world became shadows, trapped souls tethered to the mountain's hunger, feeding its power with forgotten memories and unclaimed identities. The mirror in the cabin was a window into those new lives, fragments glimpsed but never fully reachable. The mountain's power was a web, and every thread was woven with the stories of those who'd come before. Their voices lingered in the shifting symbols on the walls. Their faces haunted the mirror's endless reflection. Their choices echoed through time, warnings and temptations intertwined. To enter the cabin was to stand at the crossroads of existence itself. And the history of those who'd chosen before was both a beacon and a shadow, urging caution even as it whispered the promise of escape. The symbols above the door pulsed brighter, their warmth growing more intoxicating with each passing moment. It was then I realized the true horror hidden behind the burning snow outside. This unnatural storm wasn't just a quirk of weather, it was the cost of countless others who had made the same cruel bargain. Each person who accepted the trade stole a fragment of summer from the world, leaving behind an endless winter for those left behind to suffer. Carter reached toward the mirror, his skin burning like fever, eyes shifting and flickering in rhythm with the pulsing symbols. His voice had changed, no longer fully his own, as he explained the simple choice laid before us, remain in the frozen world or accept the gift of eternal warmth. Jameson nodded, sweat pouring down his face despite his claims of embracing the cold. I felt the pull myself, the symbols above the door inscribed themselves into my mind, offering a new name, a key to freedom from this frozen hell. The mirror showed a world where I led expeditions beneath tropical suns, guiding climbers on warm cliffs where snow never fell. But its depths also revealed the cost, a world locked in eternal ice, burning snow falling relentlessly, and guides like me leading clients through frozen desolation. The choice stood stark and terrible: surrender the name Marcus Webb, step through the mirror into endless summer, or remain and endure the burning snow, refusing to be complicit in the theft of warmth. My companions had made their decisions. Carter pressed his palm against the glass, speaking the symbolic name offered to him. The mirror rippled like water, swallowing him into a realm of light and warmth. Jameson followed, shedding his corporate identity, the symbols burning briefly onto the cabin walls before fading. Alone, I faced the pulsing symbols, their glow urging surrender, promising escape. The warmth of the mirror beckoned, paradise after the torment of the cold outside. But instead, I turned away. Stepping through the cabin's door, the burning snow assaulted my face anew. I endured, knowing each flake represented a stolen moment of summer, a fragment taken from the world's rightful place. The plateau lay empty except for my footprints leading back to the cabin, which was already fading, translucent, existing only when souls arrived to confront the choice it offered. My radio crackled with fresh broadcasts, the cold front weakening, temperatures returning to normal, strange weather dissipating as mysteriously as it had come. For now, fewer would steal summer's warmth, lessening winter's relentless claim. I still guide expeditions in these mountains, but I no longer bring clients to Whitmore Plateau. When asked, I say the weather is too unpredictable. True, but not in the way they think. On clear nights, I gaze at the stars and wonder about Carter and Jameson, living in eternal summer, while winter slowly encroaches on the world. I wonder how many others have made the same trade, how many cabins hide on remote plateaus where names are surrendered for warmth. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, I question my choice. But then I feel the honest bite of the cold against my skin, a reminder of the price of true freedom. The cold night air bit sharply at my face as I trudged down the mountain, each breath crystallizing in the frigid darkness. The plateau behind me faded into a ghostly silhouette, its secrets retreating with the dying storm. Yet, the weight of the choice I'd made pressed heavily upon my soul. The warmth of the cabin's mirror lingered like a fading dream, a tantalizing glimpse of a life forever out of reach. I thought of Carter and Jameson, faces now etched into a summer that would never touch me, and felt a pang of longing that cut deeper than any freezing wind. As I descended, the familiar rhythm of the mountain soothed and unsettled me in equal measure. The whispers in the wind, once warnings, now felt like distant memories. The mountain had not released me completely, its breath still curled around me like a shroud. Back at base camp, the world seemed unchanged, except for me. The others looked to the mountain with the same awe and respect, unaware of the silent war waging in the frozen reaches above. I held their gazes a little longer, feeling the isolation of a man who had seen beyond the veil. At night, alone in my tent, I replay the choice endlessly. What if I had stepped through the mirror? What price had Carter and Jameson truly paid for their escape? The warmth they now basked in was stolen, a borrowed paradise paid for with the suffering of a world locked in ice. Yet, despite the doubts, I know the cold is real. The honest, biting cold that sharpens the mind and hardens the spirit. It is a reminder that some sacrifices, some sufferings, define us more than fleeting warmth ever could. And so, I continue my path, guide, guardian, and witness to a mountain's ancient and terrible bargains. Each expedition a step further from the cabin's deceptive glow, but forever tethered to the stories etched in stone and snow. The mountain's language is one I now understand, a language of loss, choice, and enduring resolve. The weight of choices made and consequences endured settled heavily within me, and I knew some prices were simply too high, even for paradise. The mountains still whisper their warnings to those who know how to listen. I have learned to hear them clearly now, and I pass their messages along to anyone willing to understand. Beware bargains that seem too good to be true, especially when offered by symbols that shift when you're not looking directly at them. Some winters are meant to be endured, because the alternative is stealing summer from another world. Story 5. The darkness below ground has its own voice, and tonight I learned it speaks 3 seconds before I do. At precisely 11:47 p.m., I descended into the Roman tunnels beneath our colonial city, my headlamp slicing through air thick with centuries of moisture and decay. The municipal contract was straightforward enough: inspect the ancient aqueduct system that still fed our modern water supply, check for structural damage, ensure flow regulators function properly. What the paperwork hadn't mentioned was how the stone walls seemed to breathe in the lamplight, expanding and contracting like the ribs of some massive sleeping beast. My boots echoed against wet stone as I ventured deeper into the tunnel system, walls carved by hands long turned to dust, predating Christ by 2 millennia. Each footstep returned, altered and stretched thin by distance and time. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against my chest like invisible hands. The first section aligned perfectly with the city blueprints, iron pipes grafted alongside original Roman stonework in a marriage of old and new that had held for decades. I spoke observations into my digital recorder, noting pressure readings and structural integrity. The routine should have comforted me, but something was wrong. The silence between my words felt too dense, pregnant with something unseen. 20 minutes in, I noticed my recorder's LED flickering irregularly, dying and blazing back as if alive. Assuming moisture was to blame, I tapped it, but the erratic behavior persisted. Then I heard it. Paused at a junction where Roman stone met 20th century concrete, I spoke about potential stress points, only to hear my own voice return from the depths. Not an echo. Clearer than any reflection should have been. It carried words I hadn't yet spoken. My blood chilled as I realized, the voice, my voice, described measurements I hadn't taken, observations I was just beginning to formulate. It spoke with my intonation, my slight Midwestern accent, but knew things I did not. Frozen, my headlamp trembled, hands shaking. The recorder's LED pulsed faster, almost frantically, responding to an unseen signal. My mouth dried, my tongue stuck to the roof like sandpaper. Instinct screamed to flee to surface sanity, streetlights, traffic noise, but duty anchored me. The city needed the inspection, my reputation demanded thoroughness. I pressed deeper, heart pounding like a caged animal. Then came the second occurrence. Stopped examining valves regulating flow between ancient and modern systems, I dictated technical specs into the recorder. From the darkness ahead, my voice spoke again. This time, not merely predicting words but issuing orders. Close valve designation RT7, it commanded, yet RT7 was absent from every blueprint, every schematic I had. The command echoed in the tunnel, cold and unyielding. Close valve designation RT7. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs as I scanned the shadows for any sign of the phantom valve. The blueprints I carried had no mention of RT7, and the schematics on my tablet offered no clues. But the voice, my voice, had spoken with unmistakable authority. I forced myself forward, flashlight beam trembling as it danced over ancient stone and rusted iron pipes. The air grew thicker, heavy with a presence I could neither see nor understand. Every breath felt like inhaling centuries of trapped history and secrets. Then, there it was, half hidden behind a corroded metal panel, a valve unlike any other. Its surface was etched with symbols matching those I'd seen carved in the Roman stones above, a language long forgotten, pulsating faintly as if alive. I reached out, fingers brushing against the cold metal. The instant I touched it, a shiver coursed through me, as though the valve was a living thing aware of my intrusion. The recorder crackled fiercely, distorting my voice and merging with a low, resonant hum vibrating through the tunnel walls. Suddenly, the breathing stone around me seemed to exhale, a deep, sonorous sound that echoed from unseen depths. A presence stirred. My skin prickled, shadows lengthened and coalesced into shifting forms, ancient sentinels guarding secrets older than the city above. The voice returned, no longer a mere echo but a commanding force entwined with the very essence of the tunnels. Balance must be preserved, it intoned. The flow regulated. The debt honor. Panic surged. I realized the inspection was no longer about infrastructure but a ritual, a covenant between past and present, mortal and eternal. With trembling hands, I turned the valve. A deep rumble shook the tunnel. Water coursed through hidden channels, carrying echoes of forgotten rivers beneath the city. The pressure stabilized. The oppressive weight lifted. The recorder's light steadied. The breathing stone quieted. I exhaled, heart still pounding but tempered with awe and terror. Tonight, the darkness below ground had spoken. And I had answered. The valve I had memorized down to every detail simply did not exist. Yet the impossible voice continued with unsettling precision, describing its location, 17 feet ahead, mounted at chest height on the left wall beneath a Roman numeral partially obscured by centuries of mineral deposits. My legs moved without my consent, carrying me forward even as my mind screamed to resist. The beam of my headlamp swept along the tunnel wall, searching for what shouldn't be there, and there it was, just as the voice said, an old valve handle, marked faintly with worn paint that once read RT7. My hand reached out, drawn by invisible strings. The metal was cold, colder than the chilling air around me, cold enough to burn. Every nerve cried warning, yet the voice from the recorder grew more insistent, deeper, more commanding, edged with fury not my own. I jerked my hand back, as if the valve had seared my skin. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the tunnel's cold. My breaths came short and ragged. The darkness beyond my headlamp felt alive, pressing inward like the tunnel walls were contracting. The voice continued, listing valves and components I should never have seen, all demanding obedience. Minutes dragged, the voice's tone shifting from instruction to ultimatum. Something ancient lived in these tunnels, long waiting for someone like me. My legs buckled, I stumbled backward, recorder heavy in trembling hands, burdened further by the eerie, impossible commands pouring from its speaker. My mouth tasted copper, thick with fear and adrenaline. Retreat was no longer an option. The voice began detailing consequences, rising water pressures, ancient seals breaking, the underground system overwhelming the city above. Flooded streets, buildings undermined, chaos unleashed from beneath. Its warnings were terrifyingly logical. Engineering principles flawless, cause and effect chillingly real. If the right valves were closed in the right order, catastrophe was inevitable. Roman engineers built to last, but never for the burden of a modern metropolis pressing down. Compelled by dread and duty, I ventured deeper into this subterranean labyrinth. Valves appeared that defied blueprints, gauges read pressures impossible by official charts, junctions formed hidden networks beneath known tunnels. The air thickened with moisture and something metallic, a bitter tang coating my throat and blurring my vision. My headlamp faltered, fighting an almost tangible darkness. Behind me lay the entrance, now a distant memory. Ahead stretched passages my plans insisted did not exist. The voice ceased commands and began to bargain. It spoke of floods to come should I resist, vivid torrents filling subways, rising through manholes to drown the world above. Yet if I obeyed, it promised renewal, a cleansing, a return to a primordial state. My hands, almost of their own accord, sought another valve, RT-12. The handle turned easily, as though awaiting decades for this moment. Immediately, the sound of rushing water thundered somewhere in the dark, shaking the very tunnel walls. The water's flow was no longer the gentle trickle of a well-maintained system, but something urgent and fierce. The pressure gauge nearest the valve jumped sharply, its needle swinging deep into the red. Other gauges along the tunnel responded in turn, falling like a series of dominoes triggered by an unseen hand. The roar of rushing water surged through passages hidden from sight, echoing like a monstrous heartbeat beneath the city. Then, the voice from the recorder laughed, an ancient, chilling sound that bore no resemblance to my own. It was deeper, layered with harmonics that seemed to vibrate from the very stone walls. That laugh spoke of centuries of patience finally rewarded, of long-laid plans now unfolding. I realized then that this presence, this thing, had been waiting here since before the city rose. It had witnessed the fall of Rome, the birth of colonial settlements, and the relentless expansion of modern infrastructure. It bided its time, knowing that eventually, someone with the knowledge and access would come to do what it could not. The recorder no longer captured my voice. The words spilling from its speaker belonged entirely to the ancient entity now commanding the tunnels. It detailed each valve to close, each connection to make, the steps needed to transform the Roman aqueduct into a weapon against the city above. But as my hand reached for the next valve, something inside me rebelled. The engineer's instinct to preserve, the human refusal to be a pawn, surged forward. I pulled my hand back and spoke aloud, my voice clear and undistorted in the stone corridors. "I will not help you destroy my city," I declared. "I understand your grievance, your promise of renewal," I continued, "but I refuse to be part of this destruction." My voice grew stronger, fueled by a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. The response was immediate and terrible. The roar of water swelled into a furious tempest. Pressure gauges skyrocketed toward critical failure. Darkness thickened beyond my headlamp's reach, suffocating and oppressive. The thing raged, shedding its human guise. Its voice revealed an ancient, implacable force, utterly alien and merciless. Yet I understood something crucial. It needed me. Despite its knowledge and patience, it could not act in the physical world. It required human hands to turn valves, human skill to navigate the tangled web of old and new. I began retracing my steps, reversing the damage, opening valves I'd closed. Gradually, pressure gauges steadied, the torrent softened back to gentle flow. Behind me, the entity howled in frustration, impotent to stop me. The journey back was arduous. Legs trembling with exhaustion and lingering fear, lungs burning from thick, ancient air, mind reeling with the enormity of what I'd faced. The recorder was silent again, its LED steady and red, functioning normally. I emerged into dawn's first light, skin pale and clammy with sweat. The city's morning noises, traffic, voices, never sounded so sweet. I lingered at the tunnel's mouth, letting sunlight dispel the shadows clinging to memory. My report contained none of the impossible echoes or commanding voices. I documented structural integrity, noted unmapped valves for future inspection, and urged increased monitoring of water pressures. The city accepted it without question, grateful for another successful inspection. But sometimes, in the deep quiet of night, I listen. Waiting for the ancient voice from below. The nights grew longer and quieter, but sleep became elusive. The ancient voice haunted my dreams, echoing through the tunnels beneath the city and threading itself into every waking thought. I found myself wandering restless corridors of my own mind, replaying the impossible commands, the valve handles turning beneath my fingers, the cold metallic taste of the underground air. I began to notice subtle changes, glitches in reality, as if the boundary between the world above and the shadow beneath was thinning. Shadows lengthened unnaturally in my apartment, whispers flitted just beyond hearing, and reflections in mirrors held fleeting images that weren't my own. My professional detachment began to fray. At work, I questioned the reports I filed, the routine inspections that now felt like a veil over something far more sinister. Colleagues joked about my distracted demeanor, unaware I was guarding secrets ancient and deadly. One evening, as I reviewed old blueprints and tunnel schematics, the recorder beside me crackled to life on its own. The ancient voice spoke again, not with commands this time, but with a whisper. Balance is fragile, guardian. The city's fate rests in your hands. I knew then my role was no longer that of a mere inspector. I was the link between worlds, the fragile barrier against the darkness beneath. Determined, I began researching the city's buried history, seeking clues left by those who had faced this presence before. Hidden archives revealed cryptic references to subterranean rituals, forgotten engineers who had tried and failed to appease the entity, and ancient inscriptions warning of a price for disturbing the old waters. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the tunnels, no longer just a man checking valves but a guardian preparing for a battle unseen. The city's survival depended on balance, a balance I was beginning to understand was far more delicate than I had ever imagined. The balance was breaking. Each inspection, each adjustment I made seemed to stir the ancient presence lurking beneath the city's foundations more fiercely. The tunnels, once silent veins carrying water and history, now thrummed with restless energy, a heartbeat growing louder and more urgent. Technology failed around me with increasing frequency. Sensors would glitch, lights flicker, and communications dropped inexplicably. On one occasion, an entire section of the tunnel's electrical grid shorted out moments after I passed through, leaving a yawning blackness swallowing the corridors. The entity's voice returned often, no longer confined to my recorder. It echoed through the tunnels themselves, a resonant growl that reverberated beneath the streets and into the city above. Passers-by reported hearing strange sounds beneath their feet, low rumbles, whispers, sometimes laughter, and unexplained flooding began appearing in basements near the old Roman infrastructure. City officials dismissed the anomalies as minor plumbing issues and aging infrastructure, but I knew better. The ancient presence was asserting itself, pushing against the fragile cage of modernity. My nights became a battleground of shadows. Dreams invaded by visions of crumbling walls and rushing waters. Awake, I found cryptic symbols etched into manhole covers and sewer grates, runes identical to those in the tunnels, glowing faintly under moonlight. I reached out to historians and engineers alike, sharing my findings in hushed conversations. Few believed me, and fewer still wished to confront the reality beneath their feet. But the city's heart was trembling. A storm was coming, one not born of weather, but of ancient power rising to reclaim its dominion. I prepared for confrontation, gathering knowledge, devising plans to reinforce the delicate balance. I understood now that this was no simple engineering problem, it was a clash of eras, of forces both human and primordial. And as the first floodwaters began to surge beneath the city streets, I realized the fight was no longer underground, it was above, in the heart of the modern world. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I can still hear it, the thing in the tunnels, calling my name. Always 3 seconds ahead, whispering promises wrapped in menace, reminding me the flood will come with or without my help. The recorder sits tucked away in my desk drawer, silent but not forgotten. I've never dared to play back that night's recording, yet I know the ancient voice waits there, biding time, speaking words I hope I'll never be compelled to utter. Story 6. The first postcard arrived on a Tuesday, slipped quietly between quarterly reports and vendor invoices in my office mailbox like a cancer cell hiding among healthy tissue. The image showed Coney Island's wonder wheel, but wrong. Rusted spokes clawed at a gray sky, passenger cars dangled like broken teeth. The boardwalk stretched empty beneath it, warped planks scattered with debris too vague to identify in the photograph's grainy haze. I flipped it over with trembling fingers. My own handwriting stared back, neat, familiar. The crowds are gone now. You'll understand when you get here. The postmark read, 3 days into the future. My signature sat in the bottom right corner, identical to thousands of documents I'd signed over the years. My throat constricted, the hum of the air conditioning unit suddenly felt louder, or perhaps my senses had sharpened into a painful hyper-awareness. I set the postcard down, staring, willing it to become logical, to make sense. It did not. The next morning brought 2 more postcards. Atlantic City's steel pier, its famous Ferris wheel tilted impossibly, half submerged in dark, roiling water. Miami Beach's Art Deco hotel stood like tombstones beneath a sunset that resembled dried blood. Both bore my handwriting. Both were dated days ahead. The water rose faster than expected. You should have seen the faces. M. They boarded up the windows before they left. Smart thinking. M. My hands shook as I examined each card. The paper felt authentic, standard postcard stock, slightly glossy. The photographs appeared genuine, not digitally altered. Yet the devastation shown had not happened. Could not have happened without breaking national headlines. I spent lunch researching. Coney Island's website showed normal operating hours. Atlantic City advertised weekend specials. Miami Beach webcams revealed sun-soaked beaches crowded with tourists. Everywhere seemed normal, except in these postcards sent from a future that hadn't arrived. By Thursday, 7 postcards lay stacked neatly on my desk. Each destination bleaker than the last. Myrtle Beach's pier collapsed into churning surf. Cape Cod's lighthouses stood dark against storm-battered shores. Virginia Beach's hotels gaped with broken windows like dead eyes. The messages grew cryptic. You'll need warmer clothes than you think. M. And the maps are all wrong now. Trust your instincts. M. During the weekly staff meeting, my supervisor's voice drifted through the sterile room as if underwater, asking about budget projections. When she repeated my name, I snapped back to fluorescent lights and startled faces. I muttered something about reviewing numbers and escaped to my desk. That night, sleep eluded me. My apartment felt smaller, the walls pressed inward. I checked my phone obsessively for missed calls, messages, anything to explain the postcards. Nothing. Friday brought the game changer. The latest postcard showed a place seared into my childhood memory, the beach where my family vacationed every summer. The old pier where my grandfather taught me to fish. But in the photo, the pier was gone. Replaced by jagged pilings jutting from black water like broken bones. The message on the back chilled me to my core. You arrive tomorrow. Don't forget the lighter. M. I stared at the word lighter until it twisted into a foreign script. My chest tightened. The office grew too warm, the lights too bright. I loosened my tie, struggling to breathe. Then I noticed something else. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, then again, casting shifting shadows that danced unnervingly across the walls. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but the discomfort persisted. An almost imperceptible heat radiated from the ceiling panels, prickling my skin like a warning. My gaze drifted downward and caught it, a small, folded slip of paper tucked beneath my keyboard. I hadn't noticed it before. Hands trembling, I unfolded it, revealing a scrawled message in the same familiar handwriting. Do not trust the surface. The tides are turning beneath your feet. Be ready. No signature, just a smudge of ink resembling the symbol I'd seen etched faintly into the ruins of the pier in the latest postcard. A chill swept over me, the kind that settled deep in the bones. My mind raced. Was this a warning? A threat? Or something worse, an invitation? The hours blurred into a restless vigil as I paced my apartment, the postcards stacked ominously on the desk. My phone buzzed relentlessly with missed calls from unknown numbers, voicemails filled with static and faint whispers that faded just before I could make sense of them. Sleep was a stranger, and every shadow seemed to harbor secrets. The next morning, dawn arrived cold and gray, mirroring the unease that had taken root within me. With reluctant determination, I began preparations to visit the beach, the place where the last postcard had marked my impending arrival. I packed lightly, but included the lighter. As I stepped outside, the city felt alien, its familiar streets cloaked in an eerie stillness. A fog had rolled in overnight, thick and suffocating, blurring the edges of reality. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that crossing the threshold into that future was not just about the postcards, it was about confronting what lurked beneath the calm surface of my life. And perhaps, beyond that, the choice between what is and what might yet be. The stack of postcards on my desk remained exactly as tall as it had the day before, 1 inch. I counted carefully, 8 cards. Yesterday, I had counted 7, but now there were 8, yet the height was unchanged. I measured again, and again it was precisely 1 inch. My vision blurred. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry insects, relentless and grating. I needed air, space, clarity. Grabbing the stack, I headed to the parking garage. Inside my car, engine humming, air conditioning blasting, I spread the postcards across the passenger seat. 8 cards, 8 impossible futures, 8 messages from a self that shouldn't exist. I picked up the first postcard, Coney Island's broken wonder wheel, and held it close. Every rust pattern, every scattered piece of debris cast shadows perfectly aligned with the light source. If these were fabrications, they were masterful. My phone had a lighter app, downloaded months ago during a power outage and never deleted. My finger hovered over the icon. The message had mentioned a lighter specifically. Don't forget the lighter. I activated the app and held the flickering digital flame near the postcard's corner. Nothing for several seconds. Then the corner curled, blackening and crumbling as if real fire had touched it. I jerked my hand back, but the card continued to burn, the flame swallowing the image of the abandoned wonder wheel. Within moments, it dissolved into ash that vanished before touching the seat. I counted the remaining cards, 7. Yet the stack's height remained 1 inch. My heart pounded against my ribs. Sweat beaded at my hairline despite the cool air. I stared at the postcards, afraid to touch, afraid not to. The next card showed a new place, a seaside town unfamiliar to me. Victorian houses perched precariously on cliffs above a harbor where fishing boats lay capsized in shallow water. The postmark was dated tomorrow. The evacuation order came too late. You'll see why when you get here. Signed simply, M. I drove home in a daze, the postcard carefully folded in my jacket pocket. My apartment appeared unchanged, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder as I climbed the stairs. The feeling of being watched had grown into a persistent itch between my shoulder blades. Inside, I spread the postcards across the kitchen table, staring at them under harsh fluorescent light. 7 cards showing coastal devastation. 7 warnings from a future self. I opened my laptop, searching for any news, storms, evacuations, disasters. Nothing matched the scenes in my hands. Webcams showed peaceful beaches, intact piers, undamaged buildings. Yet the postcards felt real, undeniably mine. The handwriting, the slant of the cursive, the postal cancellations, authentic. I picked up the second postcard, the Atlantic City Pier, half submerged and impossibly tilted. My finger trembled over the lighter app again. What if burning the postcards caused these disasters? What if destroying their images doomed these places? The thought sickened me. I set the card down and backed away. Sleep was impossible that night. Lying awake, the ceiling swam before my eyes. Every sound was amplified, footsteps in the hallway stopping outside my door, the elevator's mechanical whine, water running through pipes. The world felt too close, too real, and I was caught in its fragile, twisting web. The nights that followed grew darker and stranger. The calm surface of my life fractured, revealing tremors beneath that I could no longer ignore. With each passing day, the postcard's warning seemed to seep into reality, blurring the line between prediction and unfolding catastrophe. On a humid Friday afternoon, the news finally caught up. Reports emerged of unusual structural failures along the Atlantic City Pier. Cracks spreading like veins in the concrete, portions of the boardwalk buckling under pressure. Engineers scrambled to assess the damage, and evacuations began, just as the postcard had warned. My phone vibrated incessantly, buzzing with alerts of worsening weather systems and rising tides. At the office, colleagues whispered about freak storms and coastal erosion, but none knew the full truth. None could see the postcards stacked like ticking clocks on my desk. That night, sleep eluded me once more. The storm outside had grown fierce, a relentless symphony of wind tearing at windows and rain hammering the pavement. As I lay awake, a sudden flash illuminated the room, lightning streaked the sky, momentarily revealing the dark shapes lurking just beyond my window. The power flickered and died. In the suffocating blackness, I heard the soft tap of footsteps in the hall, a hesitant, measured sound that did not belong to anyone I knew. Heart pounding, I reached blindly for the flashlight on my bedside table, its beam slicing through the shadows. No one was there. The storm raged on, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. The air grew heavy, charged with electricity not of the storm but something ancient and restless. The next day, devastation reports multiplied. Myrtle Beach's pier had collapsed, Cape Cod's lighthouse sustained critical damage, and Virginia Beach's hotels bore fresh scars from violent waves. Coastal towns braced for worse. I felt trapped in a nightmare of my own making, caught between a future I was powerless to stop and a past I could barely comprehend. Each postcard was a ghostly harbinger, its images bleeding through time to warn and condemn. As the storm clouds gathered once more, I knew I faced a choice, either chase these fading images to their grim conclusions or find a way to break the cycle before the next postcard arrived. The weight of the approaching storm pressed against the city like a living thing, relentless and unyielding. Desperation drove me to seek answers, any thread that might unravel the mystery of the postcards and their ominous sender, M. I scoured archives and obscure forums, tracing patterns in historical disasters, inexplicable weather phenomena, and cryptic warnings scattered across decades. It was as if M existed both inside and outside time, a spectral guardian, or perhaps a harbinger, struggling to alter a fate already written. Then, in a forgotten corner of a library's digital repository, I found a reference to a clandestine network of watchers, individuals who claimed to receive messages from possible futures, bearing warnings etched in postcards, letters, or dreams. They called themselves the Harbingers. The descriptions matched M's behavior, sending cryptic clues, urging preparation, yet never revealing their true identity. More chillingly, their warnings were never optional. Ignoring them invited calamity, heeding them often meant sacrifice. One message stood out. The flow of time is fragile, change one moment, and the ripple may drown 1,000. I realized M was not merely a messenger but a fragment of a fractured timeline, a version of myself, or perhaps an echo, desperately trying to rewrite a doomed future. The postcards were calls for action, but also curses, reminders that some futures could not be undone without cost. As the next predicted disaster loomed, I knew my journey had shifted from passive observer to active participant in a story far larger than myself. The city's fate and my own were now entwined with M's cryptic guidance and the shadowy forces weaving through time. The weight of those abandoned beaches, the broken piers, and the dark, hollow windows haunted me relentlessly. Every time I closed my eyes, those images returned, accusing and relentless. Saturday morning arrived gray and oppressive, mirroring the heaviness pressing down on my chest. My hands trembled as I brewed coffee, the simplest task demanding all my concentration. The postcards lay spread across my kitchen table, untouched except for the absence of the Coney Island card. I turned on the news, expecting disaster reports tied to the photographs. Instead, weather forecasts promised idyllic weekends along the entire eastern coastline. Beaches buzzed with life, tourists flocked to sunlit shores. The contradiction twisted in my mind like a cruel joke, making my head ache with confusion. I tried calling in sick but my supervisor insisted I attend an urgent client meeting. I moved through the day mechanically, dressing, showering, speaking, as if detached from my own body. The face in the bathroom mirror was pale and hollow-eyed but unmistakably mine. At work, the meeting blurred into handshakes and presentations. I nodded, gave rehearsed answers, and concealed the turmoil that kept my thoughts tethered to the postcards waiting at home. During lunch, I drove to a nearby beach, not one from the postcards but close enough to feel connected. Families spread blankets, children built castles of sand under watchful eyes. The scene brimmed with laughter and warmth. I struggled to imagine it abandoned, broken, empty. The vision refused to form. Life pulsed vibrantly in every grain of sand and splash of wave. But when night fell and I returned home, the postcards remained. 7 cards, 7 impossible futures, each a message from a self who had lived horrors yet to come. I lifted the second postcard, the Atlantic City Pier, tilted and half submerged. My phone's lighter app flickered to life. The digital flame touched the corner, and the card began to curl and blacken, burning slowly from the edges inward. The acrid scent of burning paper filled the kitchen air. I watched, mesmerized and terrified, until the photograph dissolved into ash that vanished before hitting the table. 6 cards remained. The stack measured exactly 1 inch tall. Sunday passed in a haze of burned postcards and rising dread. Each card destroyed revealed another beneath, a relentless cycle. New locations, new dates, always tomorrow. The pattern never broke. Coastal towns evacuated, abandoned, reduced to shells. The messages grew urgent. You're running out of time. M. And the signs were there, if you'd looked. M. Trust me, you'll understand soon. M. By Sunday night, I had burned 5 cards, 5 different disasters witnessed in my hands but not yet realized in the world. Still, the stack remained 1 inch tall. 2 cards lingered. The penultimate card showed a place that churned my stomach, the small seaside town where my ex-wife lived. The Victorian house where she'd moved after our divorce sat dark, boarded up, the front yard wild with weeds. The harbor below was empty, save for a few capsized boats. The message, she got out in time. You should be grateful. M. My hands shook violently as I held the card, the thought of her endangered, though in a future yet to be, making me physically ill. Despite our difficult parting, I never wished her harm. I burned the card immediately, watching flames swallow the image of her ruined home. A wave of relief crashed through me, overwhelming and swift. Only 1 postcard remained. 1 final message from my future self. It depicted a place I'd never seen, a lighthouse perched on a rocky, windswept coast. Its light was dark. Paint peeled in ragged strips. The landscape around it was barren, hostile. Storm clouds roiled on the distant horizon. I flipped the card over with trembling hands. The message was longer than the others. You're here now. The message, "You're here now," echoed in my mind as I stared at the final postcard, its ominous weight pressing down like the storm clouds swirling above the desolate lighthouse. I knew what I had to do. With trembling hands, I folded the postcards carefully and tucked them into my jacket pocket. The lighter remained in my grip, a small, fragile talisman against the unknown. The drive was long and silent, the landscape shifting from bustling streets to empty stretches of rugged coastline. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to grow, thick with salt and something else, an ancient sorrow that clung to the wind. When I arrived, the lighthouse stood against the gray sky like a forgotten sentinel. Its silhouette was jagged, scarred by time and neglect, perched precariously on the edge of craggy cliffs. No light shone from its lantern room, only shadows and silence. I approached cautiously, the wind whipping salt spray into my face. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, littered with broken stones and driftwood. The lighthouse door was cracked open, as if inviting me inside, or daring me to enter. Inside, the air was cold and stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and seaweed. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath each step, echoing through the hollow tower. The walls were covered in peeling paint, but beneath the decay, I noticed carvings, symbols, the same shifting script from the cabin and the tunnels, etched deep into the stone. I climbed the narrow spiral staircase, the wind howling through broken windows. At the top, the lantern room was dark, but the giant Fresnel lens remained, dust-covered, cracked, but unmistakably there. As I stepped closer, the air shifted. A whisper, barely audible, stirred the hairs on the back of my neck. The mirror of that final postcard was here, the boundary between what was, what is, and what could be. Suddenly, the lens began to pulse faintly with light, a sickly, pale glow that seemed to breathe. The storm outside intensified, waves crashing furiously against the cliffs. I was no longer alone. Shadows moved within the light, figures formed and dissolved, faces from the postcards, ghosts of futures that might have been or were still to come. And then, the voice. Not from a device, but from the air itself, deep, resonant, and filled with both warning and sorrow. "You have come," it said. "You stand at the crossroads of time and fate. You must choose. To accept the light and escape into a stolen summer, forgetting the frozen world left behind. Or to reject the promise and face the storm, accepting the cold, the loss, and the harsh truth." My heart pounded. The final choice stretched before me, a path into oblivion or a return to a world forever changed. As the lens pulsed brighter, I knew this moment would define everything. The loop closes tonight. Leave the lighter on the desk and walk away. Don't look back. Don't try to understand. Some things are better left unexplained. M. The postmark was dated for today. I glanced at my phone, 11:47 p.m. The date matched exactly. Suddenly, my apartment felt too small, too warm, too suffocatingly familiar. The walls pulsed softly in time with my heartbeat. Every sound, the refrigerator's hum, the whisper of the heating system, my neighbor's distant television, was impossibly clear, magnified. I walked slowly to the kitchen table and stared down at the final postcard. The lighthouse in the photo seemed strangely familiar now, though I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. The storm clouds above it swirled and shifted, as if the photograph breathed. My phone's lighter app glowed softly in my hand. I held it near the postcard's corner and watched the familiar ritual unfold, the curling, blackening edges, the flames consuming the image. But this time, the photograph did not vanish. Instead, it transformed. The lighthouse sharpened, details emerging with eerie clarity. The storm clouds parted just enough to reveal stars, constellations arranged in patterns I didn't recognize, alien and unsettling. And there, at the base of the lighthouse, barely visible yet unmistakable, stood a figure. A man in a suit, clutching something small and rectangular in his hand. Too distant to make out clearly, yet his posture, the way he held himself, was sickeningly familiar. The postcard finished burning, leaving behind only the faint scent of smoke and the memory of that distant figure. I sank into my kitchen chair, legs suddenly weak beneath me. The stack of postcards was gone. The table lay bare except for my phone, its lighter app still flickering softly. But in the distance, so faint I nearly missed it, I heard the sound of waves crashing against rocks. The salty scent of ocean air drifted into my apartment, though all windows remained tightly shut. I checked my phone, 11:59 p.m. Then, the doorbell rang. My legs wobbled as I approached the front door, peering cautiously through the peephole. The hallway was empty, silent. But just outside my door, something white and rectangular lay on the floor. Trembling, I opened the door and retrieved it, a postcard. The image showed my apartment building, but wrong. Windows were boarded, the parking lot deserted, weeds creeping through cracks in the pavement. I flipped it over. My handwriting stared back. The first postcard arrives on a Tuesday. Don't forget the lighter. M. The postmark was dated last Tuesday. I scanned the hallway. Empty. Behind me, my apartment felt different. Larger, emptier, as if the walls had stretched outward while I wasn't looking. I stepped back inside and closed the door softly. On the kitchen table, a neat stack of postcards waited, exactly 1 inch tall. I picked up the top card with shaking hands. Coney Island's Wonder Wheel, rusted and broken, passenger cars dangling like broken teeth. The cycle was beginning again. But this time, I understood. The weight of the lighter in my hand. The burden of choice. The endless loop of cause and effect binding me to impossible futures. I sat at the table and spread the postcards once more, knowing I would burn them all again. Knowing they would return. Knowing I was both sender and receiver of messages from tomorrow. The waves crashed louder outside, though the ocean was miles away. The scent of salt mixed with the lingering smell of burned paper. I lit the digital flame on my phone. The first postcard began curling and blackening. Outside, the storm was coming. Story 7. The morning I found Lake Kerguelen frozen solid, glass-like and unyielding, should have been the moment I turned my boat around. Instead, I pushed my wooden skiff into what looked like crystalline air and watched reality crack beneath my oars. For 3 seasons, I had been ferrying supplies across this remote Alaskan lake. The rhythmic tapping began as a faint murmur beneath the crystalline surface, almost like the distant heartbeat of the lake itself. Tap, 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 steady and deliberate, echoing in the stillness that wrapped around me like a shroud. My skin prickled with unease. The fish below moved in slow, dreamlike grace, their eyes locked onto me as if aware of a presence beyond the ordinary. The pike's gaze was unerringly intelligent, ancient wisdom glimmering in its depths. I gripped the oars tighter, muscles trembling. Tap, tap, tap. The sound grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the hull and into my bones. It wasn't random. It was a message, a warning, or perhaps an invitation. Suddenly, the water beneath me shuddered, not breaking, not cracking, but trembling like a living thing awakening from a long slumber. The glassy ice rippled outward in concentric circles, distorting the lakebed's perfect clarity. A shadow emerged below, a massive, shifting form, neither fish nor beast, gliding beneath the ice with fluid, impossible grace. Its contours blurred and shifted, as if woven from mist and shadow rather than flesh and bone. The tapping ceased. Silence fell, deeper and heavier than before. Then, a voice, a low, resonant murmur, not spoken, but felt deep within my chest. It thrummed with ancient power and sorrow. "You have come," it said, "and now the lake remembers." The surface beneath me pulsed with eerie light, illuminating the submerged forest of skeletal trees frozen beneath the ice. The lake was alive in a way no science could explain, an ancient consciousness stirring in its crystalline depths. My heart thundered, every instinct screaming to flee. Yet I was rooted in place, caught in a moment outside of time, at the edge of reality and nightmare. The frozen lake was not just a surface, but a portal, a mirror to forgotten worlds, a threshold to forces older than mankind. And I was its unwitting visitor. The tapping persisted, steady and deliberate, like a coded message beneath the glassy surface. I pressed my ear against the hull, straining to decipher the rhythm, not random impacts, but a conscious percussion. Someone, was trying to communicate from within the ice, desperate to break through the barrier that trapped it. My mouth went dry, my pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. I gripped the sides of the boat until my knuckles whitened, desperately clutching what little semblance of reality I could hold. Then, the tapping multiplied, now emanating from multiple points beneath me, like a crowd demanding attention, an urgent chorus from the realm beneath the frozen lake. I seized my oars and pulled with all my might, but the boat remained immobile, tethered by unseen forces. The shoreline mocked me, frozen in place no matter how hard I strained. The mountains loomed silently, indifferent witnesses to the struggle. The tapping morphed into a complex rhythm, different intensities, varying beats, almost resembling Morse code or the drumming of woodpeckers. Beneath the apparent chaos, I sensed a troubling intelligence orchestrating the sounds, a consciousness reaching out across the divide. My breathing grew ragged, sweat stinging my eyes despite the cold. Every instinct screamed to flee, to abandon the boat and crawl across the impossible ice. But when I looked over the side, the cracks from my oars stretched deep into the lake, like glowing roots pulsating with pale blue light, the color of ancient winter ice, throbbing in sync with the tapping. Through the largest fissure, something moved, larger than any fish, a shifting shadow too immense for this high-altitude lake. The tapping grew frantic, demanding, almost desperate. The cracks weren't random. They formed a circle around my boat, dividing the lake's surface into two zones. Inside, the ice remained clear and perfect. Outside, it darkened and clouded, as if something rose from the depths to choke the light. The boat shuddered violently, a vibration surged through the hull, my boots, and deep into my bones. Whatever was beneath had made contact with my skiff. Panic blurred my vision, yet the weight of the oars in my hands anchored me to what was left of my sanity. I pulled harder against the unyielding ice, widening the cracks, forging pathways through the frozen glass. The fish scattered abruptly, darting in panic. They fled from the rising presence, something alive and vast, displacing them within the frozen depths. Then, silence. The sudden stillness was pierced only by my ragged breathing and the creaking wood under stress. And a new sound, like gas escaping from an ancient cavern far below. The ice sang once more, a crystalline note richer now, layered with haunting harmonics that hinted at cavernous spaces opening beneath the lakebed. My eyes searched the frozen depths, and then I saw them. Dozens of eyes, unnaturally arranged across the ice, blinking in an unrecognizable sequence, not beastly, but unmistakably human. Brown, blue, green eyes stared up from impossible angles, windows opening and closing in the frozen surface itself. My scream caught in my throat, swallowed by the cold void, as all logic and reason fled. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The eyes beneath the ice tracked my every movement as I rocked in the stillness of the boat. Some were small, child-sized, while others belonged to adults, all perfectly preserved within the crystalline matrix of the transformed lake. In that instant, the chilling truth sank deep into my bones. I was looking at everyone who had ever fallen through ice, every soul claimed by cold water, now trapped in this pocket dimension suspended between liquid and solid. The lake had become a vast repository of the lost, a prison of crystallized time where the disappeared waited and watched. The largest eye, a rich brown flecked with gold, positioned itself directly beneath my feet. It was almost familiar, a face I'd seen before in old missing person posters or the faded photographs printed in the local newspaper's memorial sections. The eye blinked deliberately once, then rolled upward, as though its owner struggled to surface. Beneath me, the ice bulged, rising like a slow-moving wave. The wooden hull creaked and groaned under stresses it was never built to withstand. Whatever rose from below held mass and substance, even though it existed locked within the solid ice. The eye grew larger as its owner pushed closer to the surface. Features became discernible, the bridge of a nose, the curve of a cheek, pressed tight against the translucent barrier. My hands trembled violently, barely able to hold the oars steady. The boat tilted precariously as the ice deformed, forming a swelling hill beneath me threatening to overturn my fragile craft. Yet I was frozen in place, unable to move shoreward. An invisible force rooted me, the collective attention of those trapped below generating a gravitational pull far beyond anything natural. More bulges rose, dozens of shapes pressing upwards, faces, hands, limbs, all striving toward the air. The once clear surface clouded with their breath, fog spreading like a dark infection across the ice. I closed my eyes, focusing every ounce of strength on the steady rhythm of rowing. Pull, lean back, lift, push forward, dip, pull again. The cadence became a prayer, a plea to the laws of physics and the fragile boundary of normalcy. When I opened my eyes, I was moving, slowly but undeniably closer to shore. The faces beneath the ice sharpened, then faded as if distance grew with every inch gained. I did not question or try to understand this strange ebb. I simply rode, fixated on the lightning-struck pine that marked my goal. The eyes followed but made no sound. The tapping had ceased completely. The fish vanished too, leaving only the watchers, curious, desperate, accusatory, bearing silent witness to my escape from a fate they could not flee. My lungs burned with cold and exertion as the bow of my skiff scraped against rocky shore. I stumbled out, leaving the boat half anchored on land, half adrift in what I still dared to call water. Before climbing into my truck, I glanced back. The lake stretched out before me, its surface ordinary once more in the growing morning light. Gentle waves lapped where my boat bobbed softly. Fish leapt and sent ripples across the water. But at the edge of my vision, beneath a thin, impossible layer of ice suspended in another reality, the eyes remained. They blinked in patient, unending sequence, waiting for the next unwary visitor to stray too far from the safety of shore. I quit my ferry contract that very day. When asked why, I offered mundane excuses: mechanical trouble with the boat, impending winter weather, new pursuits. No one doubted me. Yet several old-timers nodded knowingly, sharing an unspoken understanding I did not possess. Lake Curilion claimed 3 more souls over the next month, hikers who vanished beneath ice that should not have existed. Rescue teams found no bodies, though the lake's shallow, crystal-clear waters made disappearance impossible. Eastern 447, runway 27 is not available. The words hung in the stale air of the control room like a death sentence. My hands trembled on the headset as I processed the impossible, a flight requesting clearance to a runway that hadn't existed for over a decade. The radar blip slid closer, relentless, haunting. "Phantom Commander," I whispered, the old nickname tasting bitter on my tongue. Memories of that fateful mission flashed, the lives I'd saved, the secrets I'd buried. Now, those ghosts seemed to have come alive, replaying a haunting refrain. The radio crackled with static, the voice pleading, "Fuel critically low. Immediate landing imperative." I scanned the radar again, heart pounding, searching desperately for any sign of alternative options. The systems blinked green, red, then flickered, unstable, unreliable. A cold sweat broke across my brow as the room seemed to close in. The emergency lighting cast long shadows, turning every corner into a cavernous abyss. Then, a new transmission, barely audible beneath the static, a whisper, layered with something ancient and malevolent. "Phantom Commander, do you remember the pact?" The words froze me. I knew this voice. Not from this world. A remnant from a buried past, a promise sealed in blood and silence. Suddenly, the radar screen pulsed erratically. The blip fragmented into dozens, scattering like lost souls across the ghostly scope. Outside, the storm intensified, rain pelting the broken windows with a fury that matched the chaos inside. I was alone in this spectral tower, trapped between history and nightmare, the impossible flight closing in. The emergency call was no accident. The airport wasn't closed. Not really. And neither was the past. Eastern 447, suggest you divert to Springfield Regional, bearing 090, distance 40 miles. The channel crackled with static, heavy and thick, like a voice struggling through the fabric of space itself. Then the pilot's reply came, distorted, distant, fading, words swallowed by time. Phantom Commander, Springfield shows no beacon. Unable to locate. Please vector us home. Home. The word weighed on me like a stone sinking deep into my gut. Fumbling, I pulled up the old facility records on a terminal coated in dust. My fingers danced across cold, unfamiliar keys, heart pounding. Eastern Airlines ceased operations in 1991. Flight 447. A regular route until 1952. The realization slammed into me. Harold Brennan, the tower's head controller for 37 years, had died that year, mid-thunderstorm, clutching his microphone, guiding planes to safety before his final breath. The blip neared, less than 20 miles out and closing fast. My hands shook uncontrollably as I rifled through paper charts, searching desperately for rationality. Bradley Tower, Eastern 447, were showing you on frequency. I could see them. God help me, I could see them. Approaching a runway erased from maps decades ago, burning fuel defying physics, following beacons dark for 70 years. The control room chilled rapidly, my breath fogged the glass. Frost blossomed on windows, the overhead lights flickering, shadows danced with a life of their own. Phantom Commander, I can see you on radar. Be advised, current conditions are. My voice faltered, unable to articulate the impossible. Phantom Commander, we're grateful for your assistance. This storm came out of nowhere. Weather looked clear when we departed Washington. Washington. Historical logs confirmed, Eastern 447's last flight left Washington National, bound for Boston with stops at Bradley and Portland. Lost somewhere over Connecticut during a fierce storm spawning tornadoes and death. The radar blip was now 10 miles out, descending. On the screen, the ghostly outline of runway 27 shimmered, a translucent memory overlaid on the present map. Runway 27, vanished years ago, resurrected in spectral form. Cleared for approach to runway 27. Wind calm. Visibility unlimited. The words slipped from my mouth, unbidden, as if channeled through me. Roger, Bradley Tower. Beginning final approach. Thank you, Phantom Commander. Your voice is fading but still audible. Then horror dawned, the transmissions drained me. My voice weakened with each word, strength bleeding through radio waves that cut not through space, but through time. I was becoming a conduit, a fragile bridge between the living world and restless spirits trapped in memory. The blip neared, 5 miles now, its shape emerging, a 1950s airliner, engine spinning lazily in ghostly wind. Ghostly faces pressed against windows, watching a phantom airport. My hands numb, microphone slipping from grasp. My voice reduced to a spectral whisper. Eastern 447, 2 miles from touchdown. Runway clear. Winds calm. Bradley Tower, we can barely hear you now. I'm here, right with you. Each word I spoke tethered me more tightly to a realm not meant for the living, my presence thinning like mist, while the phantom world grew solid and real. Through the cracked windows of the control tower, the impossible unfolded, the approach lights ignited one by one across the overgrown field where runway 27 once breathed with life. There, in the distance, the ghostly silhouette of the aircraft shimmered into existence. Its navigation lights blinked red and green, a spectral beacon aligning with infrastructure that now existed only in the fragile space between heartbeats. Eastern 447, you are on final approach. Touchdown in 30 seconds. My voice, barely a whisper now, faded like a signal at the edge of the void. The plane's form grew more tangible by the second, while I felt myself slipping, transparent, caught between the living world and the realm of the eternally lost. With a thunderous thud, it touched down on phantom concrete, the shock vibrating through the control tower walls. I watched, with failing sight but unwavering soul, as it rolled to a silent stop. Its passengers, 73 souls, finally home after decades wandering endless storms and radio static. Bradley Tower, Eastern 447 is safely on the ground. Thank you for bringing us home, Phantom Commander. Until we meet again. The radio went silent. The radar blip vanished. The approach lights winked out, leaving an empty field where the restless had found their peace. I sat in the darkness of the abandoned tower, my body whole, but forever altered. The weight of knowledge pressed down, a mark branded by those who dwell beyond life's veil. I knew why Harold Brennan hadn't simply died of a heart attack but faded away, worn thin by guiding lost souls through waves that transcended time and existence. The emergency lights flickered back to life, revealing my reflection in the window glass. White hair, deepened lines, years etched in moments. But my eyes, those hollow, haunted eyes, were the truest scars. Witnesses to the veil's edge and back. I gathered my things and left, knowing silence was the only gift left. The tower would wait, for the next call, the next lost voice in need of a guide. Driving away in the thinning rain, I caught one last glimpse of the empty field in my rearview mirror. Runway lights flickered like dying stars. The ghost of the old airliner rested peacefully on the tarmac. Engines silent at last. My radio crackled with static, and through the white noise, I heard it. Phantom Commander. Phantom Commander. I switched it off and drove into the dawn. Bearing the weight of 73 souls finally at rest. And one living man forever lost. Story 9. Beneath the glittering storefronts and bustling corridors of Westfield Mall lay a forgotten underworld. Dust-choked passageways stretched beyond break rooms and storage closets, deeper than any employee dared venture. The air tasted of rust and neglect, thick with the weight of years and secrets best left buried. For 3 years, I patrolled those shadowed halls, tracing the same nightly paths, unlocking the same doors, listening to the building's restless creaks. But tonight, something was different. The fluorescent hum carried an unsettling undertone, a frequency that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. The call came just after midnight. Mrs. Henderson, from the gift shop, reported noises beneath her floor, scratches, like nails clawing at glass. I'd assured her it was probably the old heating system, but protocol demanded I investigate. And tonight, protocol became my nightmare. The service elevator groaned as it descended, each floor echoing with mechanical sorrow. B1. B2. B3. Levels absent from any public map. The elevator jolted to a stop at B4, and the doors slid open, revealing a corridor I'd never encountered before. Pools of sickly yellow emergency light flickered intermittently every 20 feet, leaving vast stretches of impenetrable darkness between. The walls were raw concrete, scarred and stained with watermarks that eerily resembled grasping hands reaching out from the shadows. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing doors numbered seemingly at random, room 47, 23, 91, scattered without any discernible pattern. Then came the scratching, a faint but unmistakable sound from deeper within the corridor, just beyond the bend where my light failed to reach. The radio crackled in my hand as I tried to call for backup, but the signal was swallowed by the thick concrete and steel overhead. Each step forward felt as though I was wading through invisible webs, the air growing thick, oppressive, almost sentient. The scratching sharpened into a rhythmic pattern, like nails deliberately dragged across glass. I followed, my footsteps echoing oddly in the narrow space, accompanied by phantom sounds trailing behind me. At the corridor's end stood room 13, its door ajar, barely. The scratching emanated from within, now joined by a whisper, a subtle rustling, like fabric brushing softly against fabric. My hand trembled as I pushed open the door, hinges screeching with a banshee's wail that lingered far too long. Inside was a funhouse mirror maze. A sudden chill swept over me as memories surfaced. Rumors whispered among older guards about the enchanted mirrors, an attraction from the mall's 1970s heyday. Closed after numerous unsettling incidents, customers disoriented, gripped by panic, haunted by visions no one else saw. Management had sealed it away, but apparently, not forever. Dozens of mirrors stretched into the dark, their surfaces fracturing my flashlight's beam into infinite recursive patterns. Some were flat, others warped, distorting my reflection into twisted, alien versions of myself. The scratching exploded, echoing off the glass, multiplying into a cacophony of nails scraping glass. I should have fled then, my instincts screamed to retreat, escape the labyrinth, and report the room as another maintenance hazard. But some unseen force pulled me deeper, as if the mirrors themselves were alive, beckoning. The first subtle anomaly was easy to miss. My reflection lagged. I raised my hand, my mirrored self responded a heartbeat later. I chalked it up to poor lighting or an old glass quirk. But as I ventured further, the delay worsened. 2 seconds. 3. Eventually, with mounting dread, I realized the mirrors weren't showing the present, they were reflecting my past. Every motion I made, every glance, every twitch was echoed back a minute behind. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, drowning out all reason. Logic scrambled for explanations, projection systems, pre-recorded footage, an elaborate prank. But the images were perfect. Every sweat bead, every wrinkle in my uniform, every flicker of fear meticulously replayed. I tried retracing my path, but the maze had morphed into an endless loop of confusion. Each mirror displayed my past self, trapped in an infinite temporal echo chamber. I saw myself realizing the delay, watching the dawning horror. Then, in the mirror directly ahead, I glimpsed my future. There I stood, frozen in place. But behind me, barely visible in the shadowy depths, loomed another figure. Tall, gaunt, cloaked in dark clothes. Pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. A presence that chilled me deeper than the maze ever could. The figure was maybe 20 feet behind my future self in the mirror, moving with a chilling, deliberate grace. My blood turned to ice. I spun around, expecting to see him looming over me in the present, but the corridor behind was empty, only my terrified reflection staring back. Turning quickly to the mirror ahead, I saw he had closed the distance, now only 15 feet behind where my future self would stand in 60 seconds. The horrifying truth crashed over me. If the mirrors showed exactly 1 minute ahead, and he was approaching that future position, then he was already here, somewhere in the present, moving toward me unseen. I stumbled backward, eyes glued to that future reflection. Now he was 10 feet behind my future self. His face stayed hidden in shadow, but his limbs were unnaturally long, moving without disturbing the air. His pale, two long hands reached toward my future self's back. My breathing became ragged, each inhale a battle against rising panic. Sweat stung my eyes. I dared not blink longer than a heartbeat. I had to keep watching the future, stay ahead of the predator stalking me through the maze. The scratching noise intensified, the scraping of his fingernails across the mirror surfaces. It enveloped me, echoing from all directions, impossible to locate him in the present. Driven by desperation, I followed the path my future self took, but the maze twisted and shifted, corridors vanished, new passages appeared. Mirrors multiplied endlessly, reflecting themselves into infinity. My past reflection showed me stumbling blindly, terror growing. My future reflection showed the pale figure relentlessly closing in, now only 5 feet behind my future self. Details sickened me, waxen skin, fingers bent at unnatural angles, eyes void of all light and life. He moved with fluid grace, a creature never truly alive, untethered from human limits. The temperature plunged. My breath turned to fog, swirling in the frosted air. Mirrors grew icy, their surfaces frosting over, blurring my reflections into ghostly doubles. I tried to run, but running meant losing sight of the future mirror, losing track of my hunter. So I moved as fast as I dared, eyes locked on the temporal reflection. Now close enough, I saw his face, a smooth, featureless expanse where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. 3 feet, 2 feet. His hands reached for my future self's shoulders. In that moment, the cruel rules of this nightmare became clear. The mirrors didn't merely show the future, they showed what would happen if I stood still. He could catch me only if time caught up to that moment. As long as I moved, stayed ahead of the loop, I could evade him. But I was trapped, lost in a shifting maze with no exit, running from a future determined to consume me. I forced myself to map the twisting corridors, each turn revealing impossible spaces, reflections moving independently, shadows cast at impossible angles. Glimpses of rooms that defied the mall's basement geometry flickered at the edges of vision. Every second drained my strength. The figure pursued with unyielding patience, relentless and inevitable. And the mirrors whispered that the end was coming. The maze had become more than a funhouse attraction, it had transcended space and time itself. In a distorted mirror, I glimpsed myself and barely recognized the gaunt, sweat-drenched man staring back, eyes wild, body spent, as if I had been running for days, not minutes. But the future mirrors told the cruel truth, time flowed unevenly here. Minutes for me stretched into hours in those reflections, while the pale figure maintained his relentless, unchanging approach. A chilling realization settled in, I might never escape. This maze was a trap, a dark machine feeding on fear and despair. I was doomed to run endlessly, always just one step ahead, never to rest, never free. I staggered, nearly falling, catching myself against a mirror that felt unnervingly warm in the freezing air. In its surface, my future self mirrored the stumble, the figure's long pale hands reaching out. I tore myself away and pressed on. The corridors grew impossibly vast, the maze no longer confined to the mall's basement but drifting into a place between moments, between action and reflection. The figure had shifted, he wasn't merely chasing me anymore. He was hurting me. His presence in the future mirrors guided my every move. I saw it clearly, every turn, every choice, manipulated by his shadowed form. He wasn't hunting me. He was hurting me. My fear was his leash, pulling me toward an unknown destination. I followed the path he dictated, powerless. The maze opened into a circular chamber lined with mirrors of all sizes and shapes. At its center stood a chair, old and worn, its leather straps dangling, a chilling symbol of helplessness. My knees buckled at the sight. But then I saw it, the figure in the future mirror wasn't moving toward the chair. He stood beside it, patient, expectant, his featureless face turned toward my future self. For the first time, I saw intent. The chair wasn't meant for me. It was meant for him. The mirrors, the delay, the endless pursuit, they formed a prison holding something beyond time's grasp. He wasn't a hunter trapped in a loop. He was the prisoner, condemned to chase and never catch, to exist forever in the gap between now and what's to come. The scratching crescendoed. It wasn't nails on glass. It was the sound of him clawing at the walls of the temporal prison. This maze fed not on fear, but on time itself, twisting reality into a distortion where no one escapes. In the future mirror, I saw myself nearing the chair. In 60 seconds, the loop would close. The pale figure would reach for me. The chair was the trap's heart, touch it, and we would both be ensnared forever in an endless cycle of pursuit, capture, and futility. But knowing the future, I held one fragile advantage, choice. Instead of stepping into the chamber, I turned away from the mirrors entirely. I closed my eyes, severing my sight from the past's cruel echoes and the future's haunting lure. I trusted only touch, sound, and instinct to guide me through the shifting maze. The scratching grew frantic, urgent and desperate, echoing off mirrored walls as I moved blindly through that warped reality. Deprived of the temporal reflections, the pale figure lost his tether. Without a glimpse of what was to come, his relentless chase faltered. And without mirrors showing my terror-stricken past, the weight of paralyzing fear that had gripped me began to lift. Step by tentative step, I navigated the labyrinth on instinct alone, following the flow of stale air, feeling temperature shifts, and listening to the eerie echoes of my footsteps. Slowly, something I hadn't felt since entering the maze bloomed within me, hope. The stifling air warmed. The suffocating pressure dissolved. The frantic scratching faded to a whisper, then silence. Eyes still closed, I followed the warming air until I felt it, a subtle shift, a gentle draft signaling a doorway. When I opened my eyes, I stood in the corridor outside room 13. The door was closed, exactly as I'd first found it. The stale concrete and flickering emergency lights showed no hint of the nightmare behind it. I was no longer the same man who had entered that door. Something fundamental in me had shifted. I had glimpsed the hidden folds of time, the gaps, loops, and delays where cause and effect unraveled, where reality bent and fractured. I returned to the main floor, took the elevator, and finished my shift. But I never reported what I'd seen in room 13. Who could? Who would believe? Instead, I requested a transfer to the day shift, claiming personal reasons. Yet sometimes, in the corner of my eye, reflections misalign, lagging, stretching beyond my control. And sometimes, in the silence between heartbeats, I hear it, the faint, haunting scrape of fingernails on glass. A chilling reminder, some prisons transcend space and time. Some prisoners wait patiently, eternal and unyielding, for the chance to trade places with their captors. The mirror maze remains, sealed and forgotten in room 13's depths. Somewhere within its warped corridors, the pale figure pursues. Always 1 minute behind. Always reaching for what slips through his grasp. Trapped forever in the frozen gap between what was and what will be. Mall management claims no memory of a mirror maze. Room 13 is merely storage space, officially. But I know better. Some places dwell in the cracks of memory and record, suspended between fact and forgotten myth. The scratching may have ceased, for now. But time is patient. And soon enough, another will hear the sound, follow it down into the shadows. Another will find room 13, enter the maze, and see their own reflection lagging behind. When they do, the pale figure will rise. New path to follow. New future to chase. New hope for escape from his eternal temporal prison. I have thought of returning. To warn the next soul. But the mirrors show what will be, not what might be. The future is fixed. The pattern set. And the chase will begin anew. The spotlight's beam cut sharply through the twilight, bathing the nearest scarecrow in stark white light. Yet the shadow defied logic, it did not retreat or shrink. Instead, it thickened, darkening like ink spilled on parchment, swallowing the light as if the shadow were a living void hungry for substance. A cold chill slithered down my spine, and my breath hitched in my throat. The other shadows responded in kind, growing denser and more aggressive. They writhed and shifted, casting shapes that no longer resembled the simple forms of scarecrows but twisted into grotesque figures with clawed fingers and faces contorted in silent screams. The wheat around their bases bent and bowed as if recoiling from the advancing darkness. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, equipment forgotten at my feet. The shadows pulsed with a terrible rhythm, expanding and contracting like a monstrous breathing organism. They seemed to hunger, not just for light, but for something far more profound, life, warmth, presence. Suddenly, the longest shadow lunged toward me, elongating across the ground with impossible speed, engulfing the gravel path beneath my feet. I barely had time to react before it wrapped around my ankles like cold, suffocating chains. Panic surged through me, raw and consuming. I kicked and struggled, but the shadow's grip only tightened, drawing me closer to the barn's darkened face. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into near total darkness, save for the faint, eerie glow of the encroaching shadows. A voice whispered then, a breathy rasp that seemed to rise from the earth itself, echoing through the fields. It spoke no words I could understand, but the meaning was clear: this land was not abandoned. It was watched, guarded by something ancient and relentless. Desperately, I wrenched free, breaking the shadow's grasp, and ran toward the truck parked at the edge of the field. The scarecrow shadows retracted slowly, reluctantly retreating as the last rays of sunlight bled out beneath the horizon. As I reached the truck, my hands trembling, I cast a final glance back at the fields. The scarecrows stood silent once more, their shadows no longer unnatural but waiting, patient, eternal sentinels of a darkness older than the land itself. I drove away with a silent vow, to never return, but to remember that sometimes, shadows are more than just the absence of light, they are the echoes of forgotten terrors, the lingering footprints of forces best left undisturbed. The last 3 stakes felt impossibly heavy in my hands, as if the weight of centuries rested on their worn surfaces. The scarecrows' burlap heads twisted slowly toward me, their painted faces contorting into expressions I couldn't decipher, mockery, rage, or something older and darker, beyond human emotion. Their shadows stretched like live tendrils, weaving and curling with a sinister will, advancing over the cracked earth. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I staggered, heart pounding like a war drum. The field, once golden and alive, had become a battleground between light and shadow, reality in something ancient and hungry. I drove the next stake into the ground with desperate force, the earth cracking beneath it, sending a shockwave of silent defiance through the encroaching darkness. The shadows recoiled, shattering like fragile glass, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. But then a low, guttural whisper rose from the wheat, an otherworldly hiss that chilled my blood, and the remaining scarecrows twitched violently, their forms blurring at the edges like phantoms unraveling. With only 1 stake left, I faced the final cluster of scarecrows near the weathered barn. Their shadows pooled like oil, swallowing the last of the dying light. My hands trembled as I raised the stake once more, feeling the pulse of the land beneath me, a heartbeat older than memory. I plunged the stake deep into the soil, shouting a silent prayer to whatever protective spirits lingered in the fields. The ground shook, a low rumble vibrating through my bones, and the shadows screamed, a sound like the tearing of fabric between worlds. Then, silence. The scarecrows stiffened, their shadows shrinking rapidly until they were nothing more than thin lines cast by the moonlight. The barn's warped wood straightened, and the wheat whispered softly in the cooling breeze. I stood alone in the fading light, sweat-soaked and shaking, knowing I'd only delayed something ancient and relentless. The shadows had been held at bay, but the fields remembered. They always remembered. As I packed my tools and left the farm, the last trace of twilight disappeared behind the horizon. The scarecrows stood silently, watching, waiting, for the next surveyor, the next keeper, the next soul brave or foolish enough to confront the darkness in Blackwater County's cursed fields. The painted faces leered in the starlight, and I could swear I heard them whispering my name. The road was completely blocked now by overlapping shadows that moved and twisted like black water. Even if I reached my truck, I wouldn't be able to drive through that writhing darkness. I was trapped in the middle of the field with 3 stakes, facing dozens of hungry shadows that grew stronger with each passing minute. That's when I understood the real purpose of the spotlight. I stopped running and stood in the center of the field, breathing hard and trying to think clearly despite the fear threatening to overwhelm me. The spotlight in my hands was powerful enough to illuminate several acres. And if the light could create those strange holes in reality, maybe I could use that to my advantage. I aimed the beam at the largest concentration of scarecrows and switched it to its widest setting, flooding the area with brilliant white light. The shadows didn't just retreat, they screamed. A sound like metal tearing, wood splintering, something ancient and hungry forced to release its grip on the world. Where the light hit the shadows, those strange holes appeared again. But this time, I could see what was on the other side, not emptiness, but somewhere else entirely. A place of perpetual twilight where things moved that were never meant to walk under any sun. The holes were portals. Doorways that the shadows had been trying to open wide enough to let something through. I played the light across the field in sweeping arcs, creating a barrier of holes that the shadows couldn't cross. The scarecrows writhed on their posts, their forms becoming less solid, more shadow-like themselves. Some began to dissolve entirely, their wooden crosses falling empty to the ground. With my remaining stakes, I contained the most persistent shadows, the ones anchored to scarecrows that wouldn't dissolve under the light. Each time I drove a stake home, I felt something push back, a resistance that was more than just hard earth. These weren't just decorative farm fixtures. They were anchors holding something in place that didn't want to be held. By the time I used my last stake, the shadows had retreated to their natural lengths, and the scarecrows returned to their motionless vigil. The holes in reality closed, leaving only normal darkness punctuated by starlight. My spotlight beam revealed nothing more threatening than windblown wheat and empty wooden crosses, but I could still feel them watching me, not the scarecrows. Those were just vessels now. Empty shells marking places where something had tried to break through. It was the things on the other side of those holes that watched, waiting for another chance. Another moment when the barriers between worlds grew thin. I gathered my surveying equipment with hands still trembling, loading everything back into the truck with mechanical precision while trying not to think about what I just experienced. The property boundaries were marked now, though I doubted Mrs. Henley cared about that anymore. She'd gotten what she really paid for, another night when the shadows stayed where they belonged. As I drove away from the farm, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The scarecrows stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky. They looked ordinary now, just cloth and straw guardians over sleeping fields. But I knew better. I knew what they really were, what they were guarding against, and I knew I'd be back. Mrs. Henley would call again, or someone like her, because the shadows never really stopped growing. They just waited for the next sunset, the next moment when the light grew weak enough for them to stretch toward the world they wanted to claim. My grandfather's stakes had saved me this time, but they were one-use tools, their power exhausted. I'd need to find more, learn where they came from and how they were made. Because somewhere out there, in farmlands and fields across the country, other scarecrows stood watch over shadows that grew too long after dark. The road stretched empty before me, lit only by my headlights and the pale glow of distant stars. But I could feel the darkness pressing in from all sides, patient, hungry, waiting for its chance to spill across the boundaries between worlds. The desert never truly sleeps. It whispers with the voices of wind through ancient rock formations. Speaks in the settling groans of temperature-shocked metal. And sometimes, just sometimes, it broadcasts the future in crackling waves of static and despair. I learned this 3 hours before dawn on a Tuesday that would either end with my rescue or my complete descent into madness. The repetition tower installation had been routine until that point. 47 similar jobs across the southwestern territories had prepared me for the isolation, the equipment hauling, the methodical climbing of prefabricated steel sections under the relentless desert sun. What they hadn't prepared me for was the sound of my own voice emerging from a portable radio at 3:17 a.m., describing accidents that hadn't happened yet. The job had started like any other. My supervisor at Telecom Solutions handed me coordinates scrolled across a wrinkled work order, coordinates leading to an unnamed stretch of Nevada wasteland where cellular dead zones stretched for miles in every direction. The company needed signal coverage for emergency services. And emergency services needed coverage for the increasing number of hikers, rock climbers, and off-road enthusiasts who ventured into this particular patch of nowhere seeking adventure and finding only heat stroke and rattlesnakes. I'd driven the company truck loaded with equipment through the night, arriving at the site as the first pale hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, a rolling sea of sand, scattered sagebrush, and the occasional Joshua tree standing sentinel against the pale sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant rumble of an aircraft passing overhead or the soft whisper of wind across the sand. The tower components had been delivered weeks earlier, stacked neatly beside a concrete pad poured according to specifications. Everything was present and accounted for, the lattice steel sections, the mounting hardware, the electronics package that would transform this desolate location into a vital link in the communication network. I directed the tower section by section using a portable winch system and my own strength to guide each piece into position. By late afternoon, the physical structure was complete. The electronics installation followed, power systems, backup batteries, the crucial repeater equipment that would catch signals from distant towers and boost them forward, creating an invisible bridge across the digital divide. The work was tedious but familiar, requiring precision and patience rather than innovation or creativity. As darkness fell, I should have been finished, loading tools into the truck, conducting final system checks, preparing for the drive back to civilization. Instead, I was troubleshooting a persistent fault in the transmission diagnostics. The readings made no sense. Perfect signal strength, but corrupted data packets, clear reception, but scrambled output. I'd rechecked every connection, every configuration setting, every component in the signal chain. The portable radio was standard equipment, carried for emergency communication during installations in remote locations. It lived in my toolkit, usually silent, except for occasional weather reports or traffic updates from distant cities. I'd switched it on more from habit than necessity, hoping to catch some late-night music to accompany the troubleshooting process. Instead, I heard my own voice. At first, I thought it was a simple feedback loop, some technical glitch. Maybe the radio had picked up my own earlier transmission somehow. But as I listened, my breath caught in my throat. The voice wasn't repeating what I'd said minutes ago. It was predicting what I was about to say, describing incidents that hadn't yet occurred. The voice detailed accidents, injuries, breakdowns. Names, places, times. Precise and chillingly accurate. And as I sat in the dark desert night, under a sky littered with stars, I realized I was listening to warnings from a future not yet written, and maybe, warnings that I was meant to heed or be consumed by. The desert night seemed to close in tighter as the weight of that realization settled over me. The voice on the radio, my voice, was narrating my own disappearance, but from a time I had yet to reach. My hands gripped the toolkit harder, knuckles whitening with tension. The chilling irony twisted through my mind like a knife. The search for me was already underway, and I was still sitting right here, listening to the echoes of my own fate. I scanned the dark horizon, the endless sand and rock dissolving into shadows. The silence pressed down, broken only by the persistent hum of the equipment and the haunting crackle from the radio. Minutes passed like hours before the next transmission came through. This one was different, a garbled message, distorted beyond recognition, a warning in broken fragments. The static hissed and popped, the faintest whisper of my voice calling out, pleading, fragmented cries swallowed by the vast desert night. I felt the air shift, the desert wind picking up and carrying with it an almost imperceptible undertone of sorrow and warning. The temperature dropped sharply, frost beginning to form on the edges of the control panel. The radio crackled once more, and in the brief moments of clarity, I heard a phrase that seared itself into my mind, "Don't become the silence between the static." My heart hammered violently as a terrible certainty took hold. I was no longer merely a witness to these future events. I was part of the sequence, a thread woven into a tapestry of tragedy and inevitability. I knew then that I had two choices, to flee this place and abandon the tower, and likely my fate, or to stay and face whatever was coming, hoping somehow to change the course of the foreseen disasters. The desert night stretched on, vast and indifferent, as the last flickers of signal faded into the void. And I remained, caught between time's cruel whisper and the vast, unforgiving silence of the desert. The desert air seemed to thicken with tension as I loaded the last of my gear. Every shadow stretched longer than it should, and the wind whispered with a voice that felt like it carried warnings from places unseen. My fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what I was about to face. Outside, the night was absolute. Stars pinned the sky, cold and indifferent. But beneath that celestial calm, a storm brewed, a tempest of time and fate that threatened to swallow me whole. I took one last glance at the radio. The device sat silent now, its antenna like a sentinel poised for whatever might come next. I wanted to believe I could outrun the sequence, that the future wasn't etched in stone, but the relentless countdown in my ears told a different story. With the desert stretching endlessly ahead, I stepped into the unknown, each footfall echoing in the void between moments. Somewhere in the distance, the faintest hum of a rotor blade teased the stillness, a promise of salvation, or perhaps the herald of the nightmare waiting to claim me. The hours ahead held the answer, and in the desert's vast silence, I faced the eternal question: could one man defy the ghostly script written by his own voice, or was he doomed to play out the final lines of a story long written by forces beyond understanding? The heavy silence wrapped around me as I entered the Monte Verde Library, a place where knowledge should have whispered softly in every corner, yet now felt like a cage holding back something far darker. The scent of aged paper and polished wood was suffocated beneath a deeper, more ancient odor, something like decay mingled with cold stone. I was tasked with overseeing the restoration, a job that required patience and respect, qualities I thought I possessed in abundance. But the moment I crossed the threshold, it felt as though the library itself was watching, waiting to reveal its secrets, some better left buried. The first nights were filled with the usual noises of an old building settling, creaks, distant thumps, the rustle of pages turned by unseen hands. But soon, those sounds began to take on a life of their own. Books shifted on shelves when no breeze stirred the air, faint murmurs echoed through vast halls, shadows moved with a slow, deliberate grace just beyond the reach of light. One evening, as I catalogued a collection of dusty tomes in the east wing, I came upon a hidden alcove behind a false bookshelf. Inside lay a single, ancient manuscript bound in cracked leather. The script was unfamiliar, a language I could neither read nor pronounce. The air around the book was colder, and an inexplicable weight pressed down on my chest as I reached for it. Opening the manuscript released a whisper, a subtle breath that grew into a chorus of voices speaking in tongues lost to time. The gilded angels above seemed to lean closer, their sorrowful expressions deepening, as if mourning what was unleashed. Days turned into restless nights. Sleep evaded me, replaced by dreams of ink-stained hands writing on walls that bled words, of faces appearing between the stacks, eyes hollow yet burning with unspoken knowledge. The library was alive, not just a vessel of history, but a nexus where past and present intertwined, where forgotten truths sought to rewrite themselves. I realized then that Monteverde held more than books, it held memories, ancient, restless, and dangerous. And in disturbing its silence, I had become part of its story. The restoration had to continue, but with every nail driven and every pane replaced, I felt the boundaries between this world and something else grow thinner. The library whispered still, urging me onward, promising revelations, or ruin. In the grand halls of knowledge, I had stumbled into the shadows of forgotten lore, and Monteverde was ready to claim its next chapter. The story of that fire haunted me long after I returned to my hotel room. The thought that molten lead, a metal both liquid and heavy, had seeped into the very bones of the building stirred a deep unease. Could those twisted, illegible shapes formed by cooled lead beneath Monteverde somehow be more than mere stone and metal? Could they be the lingering echo of the craftsman's last desperate work, their hands forever trapped in the act of creation and destruction? As I delved deeper into the archives, I uncovered rumors whispered in old journals and letters, tales of a cursed printing press that never truly stopped working, a mechanism that printed not only words but also fate itself. The lead shapes in the basement were said to hold secret messages, words that consumed themselves as soon as they were written, demanding blood for every letter pressed. The library, it seemed, was feeding, not on paper or ink, but on something far more elusive, the stories, the memories, and the lives bound within its walls. My nights grew colder. The scratching sounds thickened into an unsettling rhythm that pulsed through the floors and walls like a heartbeat. Sometimes, when the library was empty and the shadows long, I could swear I heard voices, whispers of the craftsman, pleading or warning, I could not tell which. I began to notice other signs. Visitors who entered the reading hall sometimes reported strange sensations, like being watched or followed by unseen eyes. Books would fall from shelves without explanation, their covers scorched or marred by faint burn marks. On one occasion, I found a volume lying open on a reading desk, pages fluttering though no breeze stirred the air. One evening, drawn by an irresistible curiosity and a mounting sense of dread, I descended into the basement, flashlight in hand. The walls there were cold and slick, the lead formations gleaming faintly in the beam's glow. I traced my fingers along the twisted shapes, feeling the rough, uneven texture beneath my touch. Suddenly, the scratching began, sharp, insistent, as if fingernails scraped across metal. The sound seemed to come from all around me, resonating deep within the foundation itself. I caught my breath as a low hum filled the air, growing louder until it vibrated through my bones. In that moment, the basement was no longer just stone and metal. It was a forge, an altar, a prison. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that Monteverde was alive, not just with history, but with a hunger. A hunger for stories yet told, for words yet written, for lives yet claimed. The restoration was no longer just a project. It was a reckoning. And I was caught in the midst of a living legend that had been burning quietly beneath the city for centuries, waiting for someone to listen, to read, to remember. The library whispered still, its voice weaving through the stacks like smoke, reminding me that some knowledge comes at a price. And some stories, once unleashed, can never be contained again. Stolen words through invisible actors that only the living mind could hear. I realized then that the library was no mere building filled with books. It was a vessel, a living archive hungry for life itself, feeding on names, memories, the very essence of identity to breathe life into the silent voices trapped within its walls. The warmth of the pages where I had signed my name still lingered beneath my fingertips, pulsing with a strange life. The air thickened around me, each breath growing heavier as the chorus of voices swelled in a haunting symphony that filled the empty hall. I tried to pull back, to flee from the invisible stage, but the library held me in place. My name, now part of its insatiable hunger, tethered me to its dark performance. I could feel my past slipping, the fading memories stealing away the foundation of who I was. In that moment, I understood the price of knowledge preserved in Monteverde. Every story told, every word remembered, came at the cost of a piece of a soul, lost to the eternal whispering of pages unseen. The voices grew louder still, as if demanding my participation, my own story to add to their endless recital. And as the light from my flashlight flickered, the library's walls seemed to pulse in time with the recitations, a monument not only to history but to a hunger that could never be sated. That day, I became part of Monteverde's dark legacy. The library did not just preserve the past. It claimed it. And I could only hope that those who would follow might find a way to escape the echoing trap, before their own names, memories, and stories were swallowed whole. The molten lead cooled into forms that felt alive, sigils etched with a power that hummed beneath the surface, reverberating through the very bones of the building. I wrapped the sheets carefully and began affixing them inside the bookcases, lining each shelf with the cold, heavy metal. As the lead barriers took shape, the oppressive voices diminished in volume, retreating like shadows at dawn. But the relief was temporary. The library itself seemed to resist, creaking and groaning as if protesting the new defenses. The carved angels' faces twisted into silent screams, their carved wings fluttering faintly in the stale air. The air grew heavy again, thick with the scent of old paper and burnt ink, as if the library were warning me of the cost of defiance. I felt it in my bones, the price I had paid to slow its hunger, but not to end it. The library had taken more than my memories. It had claimed a fragment of my soul, a tether that bound me to its endless appetite. The lead sheets were a fragile shield, a temporary truce with an ancient force that would never rest. As I packed my tools and prepared to leave, I glanced once more at the empty volumes. Their blank pages seemed to pulse faintly, as if breathing, waiting for their next victim. And in the silence, I heard the faintest whisper of my name, carried on the breath of centuries, echoing from the shadows where knowledge and oblivion intertwined. Monteverde Library was no longer just a place of learning. It was a living monument to loss, a cathedral of forgotten names and stolen stories. And I was part of its dark history now, a keeper of secrets too terrible to share, a voice swallowed by the endless recital of empty pages. And somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the carved wood, the marble floors, and the echoing vaults, the ancient hunger pulsed still, waiting patiently for the walls to thin, for the seals to weaken, for a new soul to wander close enough to touch the forbidden knowledge. I stepped away, each footfall feeling heavier, burdened by the unseen weight of what I had become, a guardian bound by sacrifice, a witness to a truth too vast and terrible for the living to hold. The library had fed, it had grown stronger, but I was its reluctant warden, condemned to watch over a prison of endless stories stolen from the very essence of those who sought them. In the quiet that followed, I whispered a farewell to the ghosts, both of the lost words and the lost selves, and left Monteverde behind, carrying with me the haunting echo of a name that was no longer fully mine, a shadow cast long and deep in the pages of a book whose final chapter was still unwritten. A loop. An endless loop playing out on a stretch of road where time and distance bent to some cruel design. My fingers clenched tighter on the wheel as the radio crackled back to life, whispers threading through the static like fragile strands of silk unraveling. The voices were indistinct, yet somehow familiar, murmuring fragmented names and places I could almost grasp but never fully hear. The headlights cut through the thick canopy, but the shadows seemed deeper now, pooling and swirling with a life of their own. The glowing crosswalk had faded behind me, but its light lingered in my vision, a haunting reminder of the trap I'd driven into. The GPS was mocking me, the road outside folding back onto itself like a serpent devouring its tail. Panic crept in, slow and relentless. Was I caught in a spectral feedback loop, a liminal place between reality and something darker? My rational mind sought explanations, glitches, exhaustion, urban legends, but the growing unease clawed at my reason. Each mile burned felt both real and unreal, each passing second a pulse in a disorienting rhythm beyond normal time. I needed to break free, to find the fracture in this endless circuit. But in the suffocating silence between the static whispers, I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting patiently for the next traveler foolish enough to follow the glowing lines into the heart of the loop.